How far would you go for revenge? What forces would you unleash to achieve your revenge, both literal and figurative? What cruelties would you be willing to inflict? And when all's said and done, in victory or defeat, was it worth it? Would you walk away satisfied or hollow? These questions and more are asked throughout the story and narrative of Assassin's Creed Origins. Released on October 27, 2017, it's a game that would mark a dramatic sea change for both Ubisoft and the Assassin's Creed series, one that would and continues to carry the series forward to varying degrees of success. This includes the series' writing and narrative design, which got a major overhaul to better accentuate the series' new, more open-world design, as well as springboarding a new trilogy within the series, again to varying degrees of success. This was a bold move on Ubisoft's part, and while it certainly came with its fair amount of growing pains, some of which would continue to plague this new iteration of games down the years that would follow, I can't help but feel that, on the whole, it has been an almost resounding success. What Ubisoft Montreal gave us was a riveting tale of love and loss, of victory and defeat, of friendship and betrayal, of success and suffering, and how all those, when brought together, can lead to some unexpected places, all while we navigate one of the most turbulent and complex times in human history. Such will be the subject matter of this video, where we will analyze and dissect the story and narrative of Origins from start to finish, analyzing its themes and concepts. This will be the first of 2, maybe 3 videos, detailing the stories and narratives of the Ancients trilogy of Assassin's Creed games, starting with Origins and continuing with Odyssey. I say maybe 2 or 3 because I am, as of this writing, still undecided as to whether to do a video on Valhalla, and if so, whether it should get the long form or short form treatment, for a number of reasons. As is standard fare on this channel, I will only speak on gameplay when and where it's applicable, appropriate, or otherwise unavoidable as it pertains to the story. A few disclaimers to go over before we dive in. Firstly, for this video and those that will follow, I will only be discussing that which entails the base game, though I will occasionally use the many DLCs that permeate this series for reference throughout. One such DLC may yet, given its size and length, may even warrant its own video, so if you'd like to see it, let me know down in the comments. Secondly, while I may refer to them from time to time as well, mainly in the form of gameplay footage, I have not played much or even completed any of the other Assassin's Creed games prior to Origins. While my limited interactions with those games have left me with an immense respect for their stories, narratives, and the characters that inhabit them, I found that I really struggled to click with those games, not from a storytelling perspective, but a mechanical gameplay one. With that in mind, any and all information that ties directly to those prior games or the series at large will almost exclusively be pulled from the great and vast repository of information that is the internet. In addition, I welcome any and all corrections or additional information should I get something wrong or miss something entirely. While I appreciate that, in the eyes of some of you, this may entirely disqualify me from even discussing the Ancients trilogy and its many stories, I feel that it's important for me to be honest and upfront so that I don't potentially lead you astray with false, albeit unintended, pretenses. Thirdly, I love history, and given that these games, as does every game in this series, take place in a historical setting, I will be almost constantly pointing out historical inaccuracies or going on extended expositions adding historical context where the games do not. With that said, I am not an historian, just a history buff. While I feel I've done the best I can in terms of research, just like with information related to prior entries in this series, I am open to any and all corrections or added context if I miss any. With that out of the way, spoiler warning for the entirety of Origins' main story and a good number of its side quests, along with portions of its DLCs. There will also be spoilers for Odyssey and Valhalla, as well as a few other Assassin's Creed titles and other games, which I'll have listed here. I thoroughly recommend you give the game a try and enjoy the story for yourself, and this video will be waiting for your return if you decide to do so. Oh, and lastly, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. Your love and support for my channel is greatly appreciated, and I cannot thank you all enough. Now, without further ado, let us stride upon the sands and dive headfirst into its many mysteries, as we immerse ourselves in the turbulent times of Ptolemaic Egypt in the 1st century BC, and witness the rise of a new creed. One that will forever shape the world. Origins' introduction is strange. It begins with a procession approaching the outskirts of Siwa, home of the famous Oracle of Amun, along with shots of day-to-day life in the town as they prepare for its arrival, including that of our main protagonist, the Magi Bayek, along with his wife Aya. When the procession arrives, we see that it's in fact a royal procession with the boy pharaoh Ptolemy XIII at its head. All seems perfectly normal until Bayek notices two strange masked men standing behind the pharaoh. We then see several incoherent scenes featuring Bayek and more masked men, and based on these scenes, involving a mummy, a sword, and Bayek seemingly begging for mercy, we can assume that nothing good has come of this visit. We then jump forward a year to the depths of the Bent Pyramid, where we find Bayek, looking rather disheveled and battered, standing over a man named Rujek. Turns out Rujek, also known as the Heron, was one of the masked men who came to Siwa with Ptolemy, and Bayek, after the mysterious and dramatic events that transpired there, has tracked him down. Rujek attempts to kill Bayek with a throwing knife, but Bayek adeptly blocks it with his own mask. After swearing bloody vengeance on everyone who sniffed the air that day in Siwa, he kills Rujek in rather brutal fashion.
Everyone who sniffed the air that day in Siwa!
We then suddenly jump forward again to a sand and wind-swept temple where we find Bayek dueling with Hypatos, Rujek's bodyguard. This serves as the game's combat tutorial, and a rather dramatic one at that, with the ground falling from underneath them after a strong blow from Hypatos, sending them falling into a larger temple complex below. The fight continues in earnest, with Hypatos, for an early tutorial level enemy, proving to be a rather tough son of a bitch, though eventually, with enough time and patience and listening to the prompts on screen, we take the big Greek down and proceed to look for an exit. We follow the length of this temple, information on which I've been unable to find both in-game and in my research, suggesting that it doesn't truly exist in the real world, and get a taste of what we can expect for large set pieces such as this moving forward. Large, expansive, and extremely well detailed. Ubisoft went above and beyond when it came to portraying ancient Egypt during the Ptolemaic period in a genuine, authentic light, a quality that will be continued both in Odyssey and Valhalla. But for now, let's focus on getting out, which we eventually do, reaching the temple's main entrance, where we find another Magi being attacked by some soldiers. We help this Magi, who turns out to be Bayek's best friend Hepzibah, who expresses shock and surprise at Bayek's reappearance in Siwa, presumably having come to the temple to greet him. We quickly learn in this exchange that Rujek was only the first of the masked men, with 4 more remaining. Despite this, and Bayek's desire to hunt them down immediately, Hepzibah convinces him to come with him to Siwa to get some much needed rest. Now, it must be said, of all the intros in the Ancients trilogy, Origins is by far the most confusing out of all of them. This is largely due to how quickly things happen, with Ptolemy and the masked men's arrival, their shenanigans, Bayek killing Rujek and dueling Hypatos, and meeting Hepzibah all happening in roughly 10 minutes, and yet we're given very little as to the context of what's going on, especially in the intervening year that happens. This also isn't helped by the fact that Rujek's death in the duel with Hypatos is, in actuality, months apart, though you may only notice this if you have a base level knowledge of Egypt and its localities, and even then the game makes no note of this to the player. What do I mean by this? Well, Rujek is killed in the Bent Pyramid of Sneferu, located approximately 40 kilometers south of modern-day Cairo, while we fight Hypatos only a stone's throw away from Siwa, which is anywhere from 750 to 800 kilometers from the Bent Pyramid, depending on the route you take, and that's based on modern 21st century roadmaps. That means that Bayek killed Rujek, returned to Siwa, where Hypatos, driven by honor to avenge his master, tracked him down and dueled him some months later. That in and of itself is fine, but the game makes no attempt to make this distinction in locale and time span clear, instead presenting the duel with Hypatos seemingly taking place right after Bayek dispenses with Rujek. Again, if you have no knowledge of Egypt's localities, this may not matter to you, but if you do, then without context regarding the passage of time and location, then this may be beyond confusing, and we've barely just started. This isn't helped by the fact that we still have little notion of what's going on. We have some idea based on the opening cinematic, and eventually we do learn of what happened in the flashback sequence, but with how quickly things move in these opening stages, this opening can be rather jarring. Adding to this is that the term Magi has been thrown around a bit here, and yet we still have no notion of what a Magi is. Now, in the essence of fairness, it will be explained to a degree as we progress through the opening stages in Siwa, but again, to have it thrown around rather liberally without context may leave you feeling rather confused. With that said, allow me to clear this up and explain what a Magi is. The Magi were, in essence, an elite paramilitary police force, charged with protecting valuable areas, mainly those of pharaonic interest, such as capital cities, palaces, tombs, and borders, particularly around Thebes, though they were known to operate up and down the country. How they came to be is a bit of a mystery, though the first mention of Magi came in the Old Kingdom during the reign of Pharaoh Pepe terribly sorry about that, of the 6th dynasty, when the term referred to a nomadic tribe that came from Nubia, what is today southern Egypt and northern Sudan, and may have been subjugated by the Egyptians prior. Initially serving the pharaohs as soldiers, thanks in part to their prowess with the bow, they eventually morphed into an elite police force by the 18th dynasty, somewhere between the 16th and 13th centuries BC. They would disappear from official records around the 20th dynasty, though whether they were abolished, or had their name changed, or merely continued their duties in the background of history is unclear. By that time, the Magi had gone from being a force composed exclusively of members from the eponymous Nubian tribe to including many Egyptians as well, though this in and of itself is clouded in speculation. As for the events of origins, it would seem the Magi have continued to serve the pharaohs of Egypt well into the Ptolemaic age, but by all accounts only operate around Siwa and its famed Oracle of Amun, protecting the people and administering justice wherever they can. This protection has since been broken by the disappearance of Bayek and his wife Aya, leaving Hepzibah the only Magi around to sort out Siwa's problems, a task made more difficult by events transpiring not just in Siwa, but across the whole of Ptolemaic Egypt. Since 305 BC, Egypt has been ruled by a succession of Greek-speaking pharaohs, descended from the first Ptolemaic pharaoh Ptolemy I Soter, who was a general of Alexander the Great of Macedons and took Egypt for his own following the swift collapse of Alexander's empire and its carving up by his generals, a convoluted yet fascinating period known as the Wars of the Diadochi. Since that time, Egypt has seen its power fluctuate constantly and dramatically as it clashed with other successor kingdoms, most notably those of Antigonus, founder of the Antigonid dynasty of Macedon, and Seleucus, founder of the eponymous Seleucid Empire. By 48 BC, when the game starts, Ptolemaic Egypt, for all intents and purposes, is on its last legs, having suffered through years of ineffectual rule by less than desirable pharaohs, compounded by years of conflict with the aforementioned Seleucids, who themselves have since been annexed by the ever-powerful Roman Republic, wilting the power and prestige of the Ptolemies. This has since reached a fever pitch with the ascendancy of Ptolemy XIII, who was crowned in 51 BC after his father's death, even though he was only 11 years old at the time, though by all accounts he's been significantly aged up in the game, perhaps to make what happens to him later not so grim. Though only a little bit in truth. True power resides behind the throne in the form of shadowy regents and advisors, who have turned Egypt into a pseudo-police state, where rebellion or suspicion of rebellion is dealt with swiftly and brutally, all in the pharaoh's name, having manipulated the young and inexperienced king to do their bidding. Not even Siwa, considered something of a backwater by 48 BC, is spared from this reality, as evidenced by a destroyed neighborhood we pass through as we follow Hepzibah to Siwa proper. The Ptolemaic army has even set up a garrison in the town, something which, by all accounts, is anathema to both the locals and the Magi. As we ride through Siwa, we learn that the temple and corresponding Oracle of Amun has come under the control of another of Bayek's masked targets, Medunamun, or the Ibis. Since his arrival, things have only gotten progressively worse, the soldiers under his command becoming increasingly more vicious and disciplined in their atrocities and extortions. We arrive at Hepzibah's home, where we're quickly greeted by a woman named Rabia, a healer and family friend of Bayek's, who immediately proceeds to tend to Bayek's injuries. After some time passes, we join Hepzibah outside and go through the basics of using our bow, before we're forced to hide after soldiers looking for Hepzibah arrive, and we're quickly thrown into learning stealth and stealth takedowns, which at this early stage more involves knocking them out since we don't have the hidden blade yet. Once they're down, we join Hepzibah on the balcony, where he gives us a rundown on Bayek's next target, Medunamun. On top of instilling a vicious sense of discipline in the soldiers garrisoned in Siwa, the Ibis himself is a merciless sadist, using his position as the Oracle of Amun to freely abuse temple priests and anyone else caught in his clutches. As one of the masked men, it's assumed that he does this in service to this secretive cabal, his fanaticism but a mask to hide his and his order's true plans. It's from here that the game rapidly expands. We can go straight to Medunamun and kill his ass, but as Hepzibah points out, the Ibis is no slouch in the ways of violence, along with being surrounded by some of the finest soldiers in the kingdom. To stand a better chance, we need to improve our gear, armor, weapons, and the like. We can do this via a series of side quests that are made available to us, where we're rewarded with upgrades or resources to make improvements of our own. We can also find these resources on our own, made easier with the aid of an old friend.
Senu, old girl, in fine form.
Senu, a female Bonelli's eagle, a species of eagle found mostly in the eastern and central Mediterranean, but also known to have habitats around the Sinai and the Levant. It's through Senu that we can track almost anything, be it particular resources, enemies, and treasures, and even harass enemies if you need a quick distraction. It's unclear when Bayek first found Senu, but based on this first interaction, it's clear that the two share a close bond. Bayek's time away from Siwa seemingly done little to sever it, though it's implied the only reason Senu didn't come with Bayek before was because she was wounded during those mysterious events a year prior, Rabia having nursed her back to health. Once we're ready, either after completing some side quests to upgrade our gear and abilities, or just heading straight in, we go after Maduna Moon in the Temple of Amun, using Senu to identify him, killing him and any soldiers that stand in our way. After we kill Maduna Moon and confirm his death, we're taken to some shadow realm where we're confronted by presumably his soul. It's a place we'll go after every major assassination, including in the DLCs, where the souls of those we kill are judged, and who will sometimes attempt to judge Bayek in return. What this place is never made fully clear, though it's presumed to be a sort of entryway to the Duat, the underworld of ancient Egyptian mythology, lorded over by Osiris, god of the afterlife, the dead, and resurrection, to name a few amidst a sizable list of job titles. Now, I call it the underworld, but in truth that only covers a part of it, as there's another place in the afterlife known as the Field of Reeds, or Aru, which is an idyllic heaven-like place that everyone wants to go when they die. These two places are comparable in certain respects to Tartarus and Elysium in ancient Greek mythology, or heaven and hell in Christian theology, but even that brief descriptor is a gross misunderstanding of each place's purpose. The Duat, in truth, is a sort of testing ground for the souls of the dead, as they have to pass various demons and challenges before reaching the judgment of the dead, where they must first correctly address the 42 assessors of Ma'at, before finally having their heart weighed against the feather of Ma'at by Anubis. Should their heart be heavier than a feather, they're rejected and eaten by Amet, the devourer of souls. Any souls that were lighter than a feather would be allowed to pass to the Field of Reeds, where they would spend the rest of eternity practically farming, which, to me, as someone who lived most of his early life in the countryside and hated almost every second of it, sounds utterly terrible, so honestly, I just let the Croco-Hippo lion dog eat me and call it a day. It's here with Maduna Moon, before Bayek has a chance to send his crazy ass to the Duat, that we finally see the events that led to his crusade of vengeance against the masked men, signified by the sudden arrival of a small boy.
Boy!
Papa?
Going back a year, we see that the small boy is none other than Bayek's son, Khemu. We also meet another kid named Chenzara, a friend of Khemu's, and the two youngins going with Bayek as he hunts Ibex, the oracle wanting a pelt for some ceremony we never see, presumably involving the visiting Ptolemy XIII. After getting the pelt and sending Chenzara on his way, we head back to Siwa before taking a slight detour. Bayek has been training Khemu to become a Medjay like him and his mother Aya, but is having some troubles due to Khemu being a scared little guy instead of a chill little guy. It's then that Bayek gets an idea and takes Khemu to a cliff with a lake below and tells him one word that his own father, who is also a Medjay, told him to help get over his own fears. Jump. Unfortunately, Khemu hesitates and Bayek decides that he isn't ready. It's then that we hear a cry for help from Chenzara along with another voice, that of a soldier. After sending Khemu home to his mother, we see the soldier with Chenzara in his clutches, demanding that Bayek follow him. We do just that, only to be confronted by yet more soldiers, and a fight quickly ensues. There's no winning this fight as the soldiers are way overleveled and eventually the soldiers will knock Bayek out. We then cut to the temple, Bayek all tied up, confronted by one of the masked men. Following the masked man takes us to the deepest levels of the temple, in which stands a strange door. This door leads to what is only known as the Vault, where we find more of the masked men. Part of the Medjay's duties in Siwa, along with protecting the oracle and the people, is protecting this mysterious vault, which presumably no one has ever been able to get into for millennia, if not longer. The masked men want in, and presume that Bayek knows how to open it. This of course assumes that he does, which he doesn't, and even then Bayek has no interest in helping them, which is why they brought Khemu along to help convince him, giving the young lad an orb that they presume to be a key. Things are cut short when word arrives that Ptolemy wishes to come down and have a looky-loo, forcing the masked men to disperse and keep the young pharaoh from discovering them, which affords Khemu a chance to grab a knife from one of them to give to Bayek to cut himself free, just as the other masked men return. Once Bayek frees himself, a tussle ensues, which ends tragically when Bayek accidentally stabs Khemu in the heart.
The snake takes that as your answer. Yeah!
No! No!
We don't see what happens right after, as Bayek is promptly knocked out before he can take bloody vengeance, though we can assume that he immediately went on his hunt for these masked men, beginning with Rujek, whose death we've already seen. We then jump back to the present, to the Shadow Realm, where Maduna Moon taunts Bayek over Khemu's death, sending the Medjay into a rage, ultimately sending the Ibis to the Duat. He also comes into possession of the strange orb, which he takes with him back to Hepzephaz, still covered in Maduna Moon's blood. The two share a drink, but Bayek immediately wants to continue on, deciding now is the time to rejoin Aya, who's also been busy hunting the masked men, setting up shop in Alexandria, the capital of Ptolemaic Egypt, but we don't actually learn this until we actually wish to leave and head there. This is what perhaps makes Origins opening the weakest out of the three in the Ancients trilogy. The confusing, fast-paced opening, along with certain key details remaining hidden until absolutely necessary, at the cost of context being lost. In the case of Aya, though I've mentioned her a few times already, this moment with Hepzephah is, I think, the first time she's ever mentioned by name in-game, despite her showing up in the opening cinematic and being very clearly Bayek's wife and, by extension, Khemu's mother. Having some additional dialogue discussing her whereabouts, or perhaps finding a way to weave her into the earlier flashback might have alleviated this and more smoothly introduced her part in this story, but instead we get a rather vague mention, leaving us to wonder just who the hell she is, which is strange considering that, when she's introduced, she becomes a vitally important part of the story, perhaps even superseding Bayek in some ways. Aya isn't even the worst offender in this regard, for, as we'll discuss a little later, Origins doesn't do a particularly good job on the whole of introducing characters, which lends to this continued case of confusion. We don't have to leave Seawall right away if we don't want to, and use this time to finish any side quests or activities before moving forward. That being said, we can return to Seawall whenever we like after this point, so don't feel bad if you leave anything unfinished. When we're ready, we speak to Hepzephah one last time, who tells Bayek that Aya told him that she would be visiting a cousin of hers at the Great Library and to use the code word Serapis, in reference to the syncretic deity of the same name, derived from the worship of Osiris and Apis and made popular in the 3rd century BC by Ptolemy I as a way of uniting both the Greeks and Egyptians. Its mentioning here could also be a way of referencing the fact that Aya is of half Greek, half Egyptian ancestry, and that she's born in Alexandria, where the cult of Serapis is most prevalent, though this fact is only revealed in the game's official guide and in the Legacy of the First Blade DLC for Odyssey. With this information, the scene cuts away to the modern day. Oh, for fuck's sake. Look, I'm just gonna say it plain. I hate the modern day sequences in the Assassin's Creed games, and that even includes my extremely limited experience with the older games, starting with AC1 and Desmond. They are dull, uninteresting, and, at least for me, unimportant, and I honestly could care less about them. They get in the way of what I feel truly matters about these games: their historical settings and the characters and stories that inhabit them, not helped by the fact that they always seem to happen just when those stories seem to be ramping up, and it drives me insane when we're forced back to the modern day and have to pretend to give a shit. With that said, I'm going to mostly gloss over them and get through them as quickly as I can, because frankly just talking about them and rewatching my footage of them as I write is bound to give me a migraine. Thankfully, this scene is very quick, as we're introduced to the new modern day protagonist, Layla Hassan, who's forced out of the Animus, the means by which we get to relive our past hero's genetic memories after spending too long in the Animus, which, if the user isn't careful, can lead to the bleeding effect. In short, spend too long in the Animus, and the genetic memories of its subjects start to blend with the operators, leading to less than desirable consequences. In any event, we jump back into the Animus and begin again, rejoining Bayek well after he's left Siwa, somewhere in and around the town of Yamu. It's here that we're shown the title card, and the story of Origins truly begins. As mentioned, we return to Bayek on the outskirts of a town called Yamu, due south of Alexandria, which we can see in the distance across Lake Mariotis. While it's not our final destination, it's the perfect place to pick up side quests and level up before heading to the big city, as you may not be yet leveled up enough to be properly prepared for what awaits, which is perhaps a perfect place to discuss side quests and Origins. Origins as a game marked a dramatic shift in Ubisoft's game design when it came to the Assassin's Creed series, transitioning it to become a full-blown open-world RPG. This transition was thanks in part to The Witcher 3, a game whose monumental success sparked a surge in open-world games that I, personally, am forever thankful for. This in turn changed much of the way side content was designed, including side quests, again drawing inspiration from how The Witcher 3 handles its side quests and their accompanying stories. Origins and its sequels side quests do much of the same thing as The Witcher 3 and other open-world games of a similar ilk, providing stories that further deepen and enrich the world and even the immediate location they're set in. Only a select few in Origins directly tie back to Bayek's hunt for the masked men, with most instead focused on various facets of ancient Egyptian culture, the ongoing political instability in the Ptolemaic kingdom, the nitty-gritty of which we still aren't fully aware of yet, and the fluctuating relationship between the native Egyptians and settled Greeks. As an example of the former and latter, Yamu is the home of the Temple of Sekhmet, Sekhmet being a warrior goddess with the head of a lioness. Bayek's arrival conveniently coincides with the festival of Sekhmet being overseen by an old friend of his, the priest Menehet. After helping Menehet deal with bandits producing and selling fraudulent cat mummies in the market, a grave offense as cats were revered in ancient Egypt, we participate in the festival, betraying the champion of Sekhmet, after the original performer is found by Bayek heavily intoxicated. What's interesting regarding this festival is that it doesn't seem to be a tradition carried down through the ages, but a recent creation of the temple's leadership to attract rich visitors from Alexandria who then donate money to the temple. An example of ancient tourism which doesn't sit well with Menehet and even Bayek, showing the strained relationship between the materialistic, perhaps hedonistic big cities like Alexandria and the more spiritual and ascetic denizens of the countryside. We'll discuss more side quests as we come across them on our journey, but it's here I also want to quickly point out just how varied the side quests in this game are in terms of tone. Origins is a game that takes itself and its setting very seriously, but there's an apt amount of humor here as well, which in turn does a good job of bringing some much welcome levity to an otherwise serious plot. Much of this humor can be found in these side quests, which often provide a nice escape from the blood, violence, and occasional horror-inducing moments that permeate its main story. A perfect example can be found here in Yamu, involving a woman who ascertains Bayek's help in retrieving her husband, a man named Claudius, who decided to take a boat out to some ruins on Lake Mariotis the night before. Our job is to simply retrieve him and bring him back, only to find him heavily drunk. Claudius is also rather surprised at the fact that he has a wife, stating later as we head back that such a notion is impossible because he's a virgin, apparently. All is revealed when we return to shore, Claudius having sobered up and returned to his wife, who, surprise surprise, isn't actually his wife, but a woman who got him drunk, married him, and tried to take his virginity, calling it a virginity tax. Why? Who knows, though given that her brothers show up, my guess is that she really intended to rob him and perhaps more, since Claudius is just another rich Alexandrian here for the festival. In any event, we kill the brothers, the woman runs off, and Claudius thanks us. Not the best quest to be sure, but a nice early glimpse into what we can expect moving forward from side quests and their variability in tone. From Yamu we ride to Alexandria, the shining jewel in the Ptolemaic crown. Constructed in 331 BC by Alexander the Great following his conquest of Egypt from the Achaemenid Persians, by 48 BC the city has grown to be the largest in Egypt at that time, forming the beating heart of the Greek community in the kingdom and a symbol of the Ptolemaic dynasty's power. While very much a Greek city in architecture and in who generally runs the city, there are other districts that house both native Egyptians and the city's sizable Jewish population, though I don't think the latter is ever featured in the game beyond this little addressed fact, as well as the presence of the Great Synagogue. There's also a blending of Greek and Egyptian culture, with the Serapeion, devoted to the aforementioned syncretic god Serapis, representative of this fusion. Even still, the Greeks are the uncontested masters of the city, with the Egyptian quarter being more or less a slum, while the native Egyptians themselves are largely disenfranchised from the city's goings-on and higher societies by the majority Greeks. This has turned the city into a potential powder keg of racial tension that has since spread across the rest of Egypt, made worse by the abuses committed by the mostly Greek Ptolemaic army, with a few side quests here centered around this tension. Like Athens before it in the archaic and classical ages of ancient Greece, Alexandria was a center of culture and learning at this time, best exemplified and represented by the Great Library, one of the greatest and most important libraries in the ancient world, if not all of history. Possibly constructed sometime during the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus in the Royal Brucheion Quarter, the library itself is part of a larger research institution known as the Museion, dedicated to the Muses, the 9 Greek goddesses of the arts. Through the library, Alexandria became a center of learning and research, thanks largely to the Ptolemaic dynasty's borderline obsessive practice of procuring and copying texts, the library soon becoming a home for the works of men such as Archimedes, Homer, Plato, Aristotle, Sophocles, Euripides, Herodotus, and Hippocrates, to name a few. And there weren't just Greek works there either. Naturally, there was a vast collection of Egyptian works, but also works written in foreign languages, or drawn from other cultures and religions, such as Babylonian, Persian, and even Buddhist. All in all, the library at any given time held anywhere from 40,000 to 400,000 papyrus scrolls. The Great Library was truly a wonder of the ancient world, which makes it all the sadder when you realize that our arrival here coincides with the beginning of the library's slow decline. As it's still fairly early in this process, we don't see it in game, nor is it ever mentioned or discussed, but by 48 BC, this decline's been ongoing for about a century, since 145 BC, after the then head librarian supported the wrong side in a dynastic struggle among the Ptolemies, and all foreign scholars were expelled from the kingdom. Since then, the Ptolemies' rule over Egypt has become progressively less stable, reaching its peak with Ptolemy XIII, and as such, with their attention focused elsewhere, the library has since slowly diminished in importance. That said, the library in 48 BC is still thriving for the time being, though the worst is yet to come and not too far into the distant future. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. We still need to find Aya, and the Great Library is where we're supposed to do that. Easier said than done when there's nothing else but scrolls and melodramatic scholars about. It's then that, while standing before a statue of Serapis, that we're greeted by one such scholar, who begins to drone about some play he wrote about the god, before revealing that he's a contact of Aya's and has been waiting for Bayek's arrival, and proceeds to lead him out of the library. The man in question is Phanos the Younger, an actor, playwright, and cousin of Aya, who's actively speaking out against the Ptolemaic regime, using the power of the theater to do this. We can even help him through a series of side quests that highlights the resistance of Alexandria's intelligentsia against Ptolemy and his advisors in this way. It was he who granted her access to the library and its knowledge upon her arrival following Khemu's death, access she used to begin researching the whereabouts of the masked men. Presently, however, according to Phanos, she is in hiding, for a Phylakitai named Gennadios is hunting her down, tearing Alexandria apart and torturing anyone and everyone with possible information to find her. More on him and his compatriots in a bit. For now, we continue to follow Phanos, who tells us that he has a very powerful friend named Apollodorus, who's provided Aya a hideout. Why Aya has been forced to hide remains a mystery, only that she got herself involved in some political intrigue which, as we'll find out in a bit, is a gross understatement. Phanos takes Bayek to a monument, at the center of which is a well. Jumping down the well leads to a cavern and a tunnel which leads to some sort of underground library. A cutscene will play and whoa hey!
I missed you.
Bayek informs Aya of his killing Rujek and Madunamun, showing Aya the orb he took from the latter, before we cut to them in the cavern, where Aya recounts her slaying of another of the masked men, Actaeon, and that another, later named Katessos, tracked her down, though thankfully she managed to take him down too. Based on simple mathematics, that means 4 out of the 5 masked men are now dead, leaving only 1 more. We cut again to the library, where Aya has learned that the last of the masked men, known as the Snake, is someone belonging to Ptolemy XIII's court, information that has been confirmed by the still mysterious Apollodorus, who in fact works for Cleopatra VII, who hopes to depose the little brother Ptolemy and the masked men working for him. And in case you're wondering, yes, that Cleopatra, of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony fame. We'll dig into the intricacies of the sibling spat when we finally meet her, but for now we got another masked man to kill, Aya giving us the famous hidden blade to complete our task, a gift from Cleopatra. We're also tasked with killing Gennadios, as Aya can't leave her subterranean hideout until he's been dealt with. In truth, the reveal of the hidden blade is rather underwhelming. For a weapon that perhaps best personifies the series, it's just sort of hand-waved into existence, even as Aya describes it in semi-grandiose terms. You would think that, in a game that symbolizes the series' reinvention and evolution, both in terms of narrative and gameplay, that more weight would be attributed to our finally receiving this weapon, but beyond Aya's brief historical and philosophical descriptor, not much more is given to it. This is in stark contrast to Valhalla, whereupon when Eivor receives the hidden blade, special attention is paid to it, the game taking the time to make clear its importance, again both narratively and mechanically. Even Odyssey, which doesn't feature the hidden blade, save for an early version in one of its DLCs, makes a point of getting across the importance of the broken spear and its special place within the narrative. Given that Origins is, as the title oh so bluntly suggests, tells the story of how the Assassin's Brotherhood first emerged, along with the early version of its creed and its many growing pains, it's bizarre that more time isn't afforded to this moment in the hideout to let that weight sink in. We just got the Hidden Blade, goddammit, one of the most recognizable weapons in gaming, but nah, it ain't that special. Just a weapon used to kill tyrants like Xerxes and dispense justice upon the wicked, no big deal. We can complete our assigned tasks in any order we wish, but for now let's start with the Phylakitai. Contrary to their depiction in-game, the Phylakitai, or Phylakes, were merely a police force common across Ptolemaic Egypt, functioning no differently than police in our present day. The word Phylakes literally means watchers, guards, or sentinels, coming from the ancient Greek root word of phylax. Their day-to-day roles were incredibly varied, from keeping the peace and arresting criminals, to guarding trade routes and places of importance, be it at the state or local level, to administrative duties such as collecting taxes. In essence, they were the localized arm of the Ptolemaic state, with a considerable amount of freedom in how they exercised their authority. This stands in stark contrast to their depiction in Origins, which is that of an elite paramilitary force, violently hunting down those deemed dangerous to the state and the will of the pharaoh, though it's hypothesized later that they're truly acting on the will of the masked men who are manipulating the young Ptolemy to do their bidding. After we dispense with Gennadios, who's situated in a fort within the city, he'll warn us in the Shadow Realm that his compatriots will hunt us to the end of our days. Scattered throughout parts of Egypt, if they catch sight of us, they'll immediately attack, and depending on our level, we either gotta kill them or run for the hills. Why Ubisoft made this change regarding the Phylakitai, beyond providing us with high-level enemies to either track down or avoid, is unclear, though the presence of a more historically authentic Phylakitai in the Fayum Oasis, investigating a series of murders committed by Wadjet cultists, suggests that the presence of Phylakitai like Gennadios and his ilk was a recent change. Gennadios will claim that he was only fulfilling his duty hunting Alea, which is kind of fair, but their use of wanton violence and brutality, I think, is meant to be a continued representation of how far the kingdom has fallen, orked by the shadowy cabal that controls the young Ptolemy and holds real power, though whether the Phylakes are aware of this is unclear. Going after the snake is a two-part affair. We first start at the royal palace, where we search the royal scribe's office while he's away at the bathhouse. Searching his office, we discover that the royal scribe, a man named Eudoros, is none other than the snake himself. From there we head to the bathhouse, where, donning only the hidden blade and a towel, we go on the hunt for the snake. We find him in a private bath, where a tussle ensues. Bayek manages to kill him finally, though not before losing his ring finger in the process. A familiar look, wouldn't you say? In the Shadow Realm, we get some rather foreboding messaging. For one, Eudoros claims to have had nothing to do with Khemu's death in Siwa, calling the whole fiasco a disaster, before claiming that the snake will never die.
The snake will never die. Son of Apep, the Lord of the Duat awaits.
Leaving the bathhouse, we rejoin Aya at the top of the Paneum, where the two get rather busy, before we're suddenly forced back to Layla and the modern day. Oh, for fuck's sake. See what I mean? Things are just getting spicy in Alexandria, no pun intended, and we're suddenly brute forced into waltzing with this schmuck. God, I hate these sequences so much. Anyways, let's make this quick. Layla wakes up from the Animus and can apparently sense Aya's presence, suspecting that she's buried nearby. The cave she's presently is, in fact, Bayek's tomb, and Layla reasons that, since spouses were usually buried together in ancient Egypt, that Aya's tomb will be nearby. Sure enough, after following some strange ghost figment whatever, we find Aya's final resting place, and with a hidden blade she somehow has, Layla takes a DNA sample and plugs it into the Animus before jumping back in. We get a brief taste of Aya's memories, but can't jump into them because they aren't ready yet, so for now we rejoin Bayek as he sits with Aya atop the Paneum. Bayek's thoughts are troubled. Still dwelling on Eudoros' words before he was sent to the Duat, he can't help but wonder if there's still more masked men out there, including the one responsible for Khemu's death. In the hopes of settling his mind, Aya tells him to meet with Apollodorus, her mysterious benefactor and Cleopatra's servant, starting with meeting his contact at the Hippodrome, located due east of the city. The Hippodrome of Alexandria, also known as the Lacheon, is where we can participate in chariot races, though I myself haven't done much of them as I frankly suck absolute dog at them. There are also a couple of side quests to be found in and around the Hippodrome revolving around the factional nature of these chariot races, though considering the idea of factions based on 4 particular colors in chariot races is presumably a creation of the Romans, the historical authenticity of such tribalism existing in Greco-Egyptian culture is questionable at best. We find Apollodorus' contact with little to no effort because magic, I guess, who tells us that Apollodorus will appear only at night at a nearby lighthouse and only if he deems us worthy. In any event, we wait for nightfall and finally meet Cleopatra's mysterious loyal servant, who's already in a bit of a pickle, involving some man named Damastes and an important scroll. Untrusting of Bayek, he asks that we retrieve both the man and the scroll. Do this and he'll tell all that he knows. Sounds easy enough, only that after rescuing him, we learn that Damastes doesn't have the scroll, having hid it away on a ship that he was on, which is now at the bottom of a nearby lake after it was sunk. No matter, we head into the lake, get the scroll, and return to Apollodorus, who thanks us for our efforts. He asks that we escort him to his villa, where Cleopatra is currently staying. Along the way, we learn that he too was hunting the very same masked men that Bayek and Aya have, and that he believes Eudorus was the man responsible for manipulating the young Ptolemy. Upon reaching the villa and heading inside, we're finally introduced to the woman herself. Cleopatra VII Thea Philopater.
She doesn't hold the ground. Please.
Where is my opium pipe? I will sleep with anyone as long as they agree to be executed in the morning.
Cleopatra, as far as the real history is concerned, is an astoundingly complicated figure, both celebrated and reviled in equal measure, but I find her character and origins to be somewhat lackluster, simplistic, and dare I say, shallow, given her vital importance to the overarching plot. This isn't helped by the fact that the writers have seemed to lean heavily on the more negative aspects attributed to her by contemporary scholars, most of whom were Roman, and their writings were heavily propagandized in favor of the first Roman Emperor Augustus, known before then as Octavian, who would overthrow Cleopatra in 30 BC during his civil war with Mark Antony. Today, much of this negativity is attributed to the sole fact that she was a very powerful and influential woman in a male-dominated world, these scholars often portraying her as nothing more than a venomous seductress, using her sex and beauty as a means to obtain allies, favors, and power. How much of this is true is questionable given this oft-blatant bias, but in Origins there seems to be little to no attempt to balance this out with the other side of her character that is also attested, if not nearly as much, that of a shrewd queen with a strong personality, sharp wit, and even sharper intellect. We do get flashes here and there, but it almost seems drowned out by the hedonism and promiscuity that is most attributed to her, which is the first thing we see when we first encounter her at Apollodorus' villa. Additionally, what we do see seems rather dumbed down to her merely wanting the throne because she and her younger brother don't get along, which is partly true and is largely in keeping with the dynastic disputes that have plagued the Ptolemies for nearly the last century and a half, but fails to fully flesh her out as a character. Compounding this is the fact that the game does a miserable job of explaining why the two siblings are at each other's throats in the first place. Egypt isn't just in the midst of an era of despotic rule or crisis. It's in the midst of a full-blown civil war, one that kicked off earlier in 48 BC when Ptolemy XIII, backed by his powerful regent, the eunuch Pothinus, kicked Cleopatra out of the country so that he could be sole ruler. Now this deposition isn't without cause, so don't think that Cleopatra is entirely innocent. Being considerably older and perhaps already well versed in the art of court intrigue, Cleopatra was leveraging her status to increase her power, minting coins in her visage, while omitting the young Ptolemy from official court documents. The two were supposed to share power, as stipulated by the will of their father, Ptolemy XII Auletes, or Neos Dionysus. The Ptolemies got rather extravagant with their names, the siblings carrying on the pharaonic tradition of intermarriage between siblings. But Cleopatra's increasing power ultimately led to her exile and being declared a criminal by Ptolemy and Pothinus. Not one to lie down, Cleopatra fled to Syria, where she raised an army of her own and marched into Egypt, and the two have been trading blows ever since. This is all very interesting and could have been used to add further depth to the story and overarching conflict, but so little of it is used, let alone mentioned. For starters, we never see the army that Cleopatra assembled. There are rebels we come across on our travels, either imprisoned in forts or actively fighting the Ptolemaic army, and there's even a few side quests that involve them, but whether they're part of Cleopatra's mystery army or independent or a combination of both is never made clear. There's also the complete omission of a key character in this dynastic spat, a third player of sorts, that of Cleopatra and Ptolemy's other sister, Arsinoe, who made her own claim to the throne in 48 BC as Arsinoe IV. She plays a significant role in the conflict yet to come when a certain man with a penchant for conquest shows up, and yet she's nowhere to be found. Hell, she doesn't even get a mention. While I appreciate that this may be a case of the writers wanting to slim down the history to streamline the plot, as someone who loves history, particularly ancient history, I can't help but feel disappointed in this omission. They could have created a quest chain involving Arsinoe that could have explored the messy intricacies of Ptolemaic politics without getting in the way and muddying the main story, thereby keeping it succinct while having the option of deeper exploration. Instead, it's as if she doesn't exist, which is ridiculous since, historically, Cleopatra saw her as such a threat to her power after the Civil War that she ended up having her executed despite her already being in exile in Ephesus and Anatolia after all was said and done. Introductions are made between the Queen and Bayek, with Aya, who's presumably been here the whole time, joining them shortly after. We're also introduced to Pasherenptah, High Priest of the Temple of Ptah in Memphis. More on him a little later. Now, you're probably wondering how Cleopatra connects to our hunt for the Master Men, and it's here that we finally get some answers. Eudoros and those like him are members of the Order of Ancients, the Master Men behind Khemu's death, but also the shadowy cabal controlling and manipulating Ptolemy XIII and who forced Cleopatra into exile. They seek to control all of Egypt, and in doing so have begun to sow death, destruction, and tyranny across the land, all but confirming Bayek's suspicions that there are more of them beyond the 5 already sent to the Duat, with 4 names added to the list: the Scarab, the Hyena, the Lizard, and the Crocodile. Of course, none of this matters to Bayek. He couldn't give a toss about some dynastic dispute between siblings, but it's pretty clear right from the get-go what Cleopatra and her allies are getting at: help her regain her throne by offing the order, and in so doing get his revenge for the death of Khemu. With this in mind, Cleopatra names Bayek her Medjai, protector of the true pharaoh of Egypt, with a fancy new badge to boot. Bayek naturally accepts this offer, albeit somewhat reluctantly, before we cut to the next day, where we set off on the hunt for our targets, leaving Aya to complete other, just as important work, which we'll be seeing a little later. It's at this point that the introduction truly ends and the true meat of the story begins, with a new set of targets and desire for vengeance, though, as with anything, none of it will be so simple, as the true depravity of our foe begins to unfold before us. With the 4 new order aliases given to us, we can pursue them in any order we choose, though for this video we're going to go in the order recommended by the game based on their given level, starting with the Scarab. Very little is said about them, only that they're moving with the endless sands that swallow up entire villages across the Nile Delta. What does that mean? Who the hell knows? Guess we'll have to follow their trail to find out. That trail begins in the town of Sais, an ancient city that was once capital of Egypt during the 26th dynasty, where we make contact with one of Apollodorus' informants, a master brewer named Harkuf, who's been keeping close tabs on the Order's operations in the Nome of Sabires. As an aside, a nome is a province or administrative district in ancient Egypt ruled by a nomarch, a system that originated from the Bronze Age and persisted through Ptolemaic and Roman rule, ending with the Muslim conquest of the country in the 640s AD. We find Harkuf, and after initial introductions are made, we head for his home where he recounts tales of the Scarab's cruelty, that of mutilations, disappearances, and the Scarab's calling card, buried in the sand up to the neck, left to suffer a slow, agonizing death. Of course, these are only stories and rumors, for no one, not even Harkuf, is entirely sure the Scarab even exists. There are more real, just as cruel villains at work in Sais and across the Nome, namely one Sefetu, nomarch of Sapires. Sefetu doesn't feature in the hunt for the Scarab themselves, but it's strongly implied that he's aligned himself with the Order member, carrying out his despotic will in return for immense wealth and power. All side quests in Sapires revolve around undermining his authority, ending with his death after Harkuf gets captured. From Harkuf, we learn of a man named Gupa, father-in-law to a powerful man named Taharka, who dared to ask questions about the Scarab. The end result? Near beaten to death and his tongue cut out. Nevertheless, Bayek wants to meet with him, and we learn of his whereabouts from his grandson, Kawab, who tells us that he left on the road to a nearby Ptolemaic camp, which all but confirms that he's been captured. Again. No matter, we find Gupa, rescue him from his cage, and bring him back to the family estate in Sais, where we find Kawab and, shortly after, Maharet, Gupa's daughter and husband to the aforementioned Taharka. From Gupa, we learn that the Scarab is summoning warriors to Letopolis, a city in the south. It's also where Taharka is, Maharet insisting that he can help us in our search for the scarab. With this information, we head straight there. Letopolis, also known as Kem in ancient Egyptian, was an ancient city that had been previously abandoned and swallowed by the desert, though when exactly has been difficult to pinpoint. As of the events of Origins, however, a great effort has been made to uncover and restore the city to its former glory. A project headed up by none other than Taharka, who's made its restoration his dream, in the hopes of establishing a legacy that will stand the test of time. Restoring Letopolis and establishing this legacy permeates nearly every facet of his character, as we can see upon first meeting him in the city's Temple of Horus. He also seems rather uninterested in discussing the scarab, though he feels guilt over what happened to Gupa, believing it to be a sort of punishment from the gods, though he can't say why. Our conversation is cut short when a worker informs us that some bandits have come to raid the city, using a sudden sandstorm as cover. Following Taharka, we handle the raiders, before continuing to follow Taharka and his posse to their hideout to deal with them once and for all. After that, Taharka invites Bayek to his home for dinner, so that he might share all he knows about the scarab. While riding to the hideout, Taharka will wax poetically about his dream of Letopolis, that it's more than about establishing a legacy, but also a desire to prove a point. Everyone thought his dream of restoring Letopolis was a doomed endeavor, thanks to the combination of regular sandstorms blowing in from the desert, along with the raiders. And yet, through it all, and thanks to Bayek's timely intervention, Taharka's dream persisted. His dream that any man can overcome any obstacle, be it physical or godly, if they put their mind to it. After all, as he puts it, if you don't reach for the stars, how will you know how close you can get? It's an optimism that seems bereft across Sapirez, given the shadow cast by the scarab and the Nomarch Sefetu, yet Letopolis seems to have escaped it, or is perhaps immune to it. Wander around the unburied city and you'll notice all seems well in comparison to nearby Sais. There are no soldiers to be found, save for Taharka's own guards, and any problems mostly revolve around work-related accidents and the shenanigans of the aforementioned bandits harassing Taharka's efforts. Those aside, Letopolis seems like a little pocket of tranquility, far removed from the civil war and machinations of the Order, despite the scarab's shadowy influence across the rest of the Nome. Even Taharka seems unconcerned by the scarab, stating that they only go after the weak, while he is a powerful man, more than capable of defending himself. Sure, it's not entirely easy, but the people, for the most part, are content with their lot, the chance at a free house if they can dig it up being a pretty decent offer, and the people tend to sing Taharka's praises for bringing life and prosperity to what was once a wasteland. It all seems too good to be true. An ancient city once lost and now reborn, thriving amidst a veritable shitstorm of tyranny, conflict, and suffering, compounded by the environment and the schemes of desert-dwelling thugs and zealots. Surely it ain't all just a facade, right? We return to Taharka's home in the Temple of Horus, where we sit down for a nice meal, joined by the rest of the family. If you're like me and starting to get a bad feeling about it all, consider yourself foretelling, because as soon as Bayek drinks some of the wine, he quickly falls ill before blacking out while Taharka kneels over him. When he wakes up, we find Bayek in the desert, buried up to his neck. The Scarab's calling card. In case it wasn't obvious from the snake ring finger, the venomous smile as Bayek slips out of consciousness, and the fact the game tells you, Taharka is the Scarab. The shadow in the night, the insect that stings, who set Sefetu upon the people of Sapirez, who cut out their own father-in-law's tongue, is the very same man with the dream of reaching for the stars. How, you may ask? Well, we don't get exact specifics, but we can infer that the project at Letopolis is merely a facade to mask its true operations with the Nome, that of furthering the Order's influence over the Nile Delta. But that in and of itself is drenched in both irony and half-truths, as we'll discuss in a little bit. The next few minutes are spent watching Bayek stuck in the sand, which, for being still fairly early in the story, is a pretty sad affair, as he more or less accepts his fate at the hands of the Scarab. A strange mirage in the figure of a person will appear and stand before Bayek, but say nothing, before disappearing just as quickly as they appear. Who this person is supposed to be is never revealed, nor their purpose for appearing. My guess is Aya, based on the more slender figure, but that's frankly all I got beyond that, apart from Bayek just simply hallucinating due to being in the baking sun and heat for what's presumably already been quite some time. We're then prompted to whistle our horse, who miraculously shows up, and after some prodding from Senu, the horse will gallop past. Bayek, who somehow managed to get his arm free, will grab hold of the loose reins and pull himself free, which... Okay, I know that this is a video game and all, but Bayek being able to free himself is beyond the bounds of possibility. For one, how was he able to get his one arm free? The Scarab burying people up to their necks is supposed to be a death sentence, one that no one can escape from because, well... Adding to that, being pulled by the horse alone wouldn't be enough to yank him free, again because it's supposed to be an inescapable death sentence. At best, Bayek's shoulder is dislocated. At worst, his arm gets ripped off. Okay, enough nitpicking. Now that we're free, we need to get our stuff back, which is being held at a nearby camp. Once we get it all back, our task is simple: to take down Taharka, to end the Scarab for good. We return to the temple in Letopolis to find it crawling with soldiers, both within and without, a sharp contrast to how it was before. Getting to the Scarab looks to be no simple task, but thankfully he hangs around the temple where it's open to the sky, providing the perfect spot to end his miserable life. That said, because it's me we're talking about, I'm bound to fuck it up somehow, as you can see. In any event, once we take him down and any guards that get in our way, we meet with him in the Shadow Realm, where the mask finally comes off, where he expresses regret over his actions, but that it was all for a good cause, for his dream of reaching for the stars and achieving everlasting glory. What this suggests to me is that he merely joined the Order to achieve this dream, as they were the only ones with the means that Taharka couldn't acquire on his own. If achieving such a legacy meant mutilating and murdering folk, such as cutting out his father-in-law's own tongue, then it was a price he would willingly pay, even if it sat heavy on his soul. While I wish this scene was a bit longer, I think it serves well as a good early indicator of just how corrupting the Order can be, that they can turn a supposedly good and honest man into a monster simply by dangling the promise of glory in front of his eyes, a trait shared by their successor, the Templars. It also highlights the frailty of a man's convictions, for Taharka seems keenly aware of this pitfall, but chose to forsake his morality for his dream, and in so doing committed himself to the Order's vision, a commitment that ultimately cost him his dream and his life. We send Taharka off to be judged and return to the present, but unfortunately we don't get a chance to pat ourselves on the back for a job well done, because it's at this moment Taharka's family shows up. As you might expect, none of them are ecstatic about seeing dear old Taharka, loving father and husband, lie dead in the sand, but who can exactly blame them, for up until now they've been kept entirely in the dark about Taharka being the Scarab, save for old Gupa, who couldn't exactly say anything, being a tongue short and all. Kawab will try to fight Bayek, while Maharet curses Bayek, though she quickly changes her tune when Bayek reveals the truth, confirmed by Gupa. Bayek will then walk away and apologize to Khemu. At first I wasn't sure why he did, but upon further reflection I think I get it now. Just as his son was taken from him, his father, he's now gone and flipped the script, taking a father away from his son, thereby potentially continuing the cycle of violence and revenge. And it's a cycle that actually has a conclusion. In the Hidden Ones DLC, set several years after the events of the base game in the Sinai Peninsula, we'll be hunted by mercenaries in the employ of someone called the Shadow of the Scarab. Upon further investigation, we find that the Shadow was none other than a much older Kawab, still seething over Bayek's murder of his father and seeing no other path outside of honoring Taharka's legacy. This storyline ends with the two making amends and Bayek recruiting Kawab into his organization, the name of which I'm not going to mention yet, though you'll almost certainly know which one I'm talking about, thereby ending the cycle before it could go any further. While not the most nuanced revenge story and can come off as a bit too on the nose, it shows that tragedy often begets tragedy and how sometimes all it takes to end such a cycle is extending a hand, showing the light, and offering forgiveness. After this, the screen cuts to black, where Taharka's unaliving is confirmed, and we're told that Aya's DNA has finally finished sequencing in the modern day, if a bit fragmented. We're then transported to the Aegean coast, where we take control of Aya as she commands a trireme, alongside the highly eccentric and ever-hilarious Greek mercenary captain Phoxidas and Damastes, the man we rescued for Apollodorus back in Alexandria. This is the first of a few sequences where we're put in Aya's shoes to see what she gets up to while Bayek hunts members of the Order. In this instance, she and Phoxidas are under orders from Cleopatra to deliver a chest full of treasure to a certain Roman general with whom she wishes to form an alliance. And who might this certain general be? Why, none other than Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, better known in the English-speaking world as Pompey the Great. As we sail towards him, we learn that Cleopatra wishes to ally with Pompey and make use of his army to take back the throne, along with possibly an offer of marriage. Remember that scroll we had to fish out of the lake for Apollodorus, the one that Damastes lost? It just so happened to be an official letter to Pompey, thus the utmost importance in retrieving it. Flash forward a little while later, Aya and Phoxidas have a chest full of gold and other treasures for the general, a final overture of friendship and alliance in the hopes of swaying Pompey over to Cleopatra's side. All very intriguing, but I have to question the logic in this. For that, we need to dive into the flow of history for a moment. Since 49 BC, the Roman Republic has been embroiled in its own civil war, with Pompey and most of the Roman Senate squaring off against Julius Caesar, the intricacies of which are far too complex for this video. If you want to learn more, Kings and Generals has an excellent series of videos on the subject that I highly recommend. While the war would end up lasting until 45 BC, arguably the most decisive battle of the war came early in August 48 BC at Pharsalus, where Pompey was utterly crushed by Caesar despite vastly outnumbering him. Devastated, Pompey fled, first to Mytilene, then to Cilicia, where he planned his next move. That next move would be to flee to Egypt, so he could leverage the country's wealth and strategic importance. He was also already allied to Ptolemy XIII and thus believed he would find Egypt a safe harbor to reorganize and renew his war effort against Caesar. Now, Pompey already being embroiled in a civil war of his own in and of itself isn't a problem. Roman civil wars before, during, and after in the Republican period tended to be multinational affairs anyways, given Rome's extensive network of allies and tributaries. The problem is the logic behind Cleopatra's decision to ally with Pompey. If I got the timeline right, this planned meeting in the Aegean is taking place after the Battle of Pharsalus, when Pompey was at his absolute lowest. Egypt is not in a vacuum. Surely word of Pompey's defeat would have spread across the whole of the Mediterranean at lightning speed, especially given Caesar's penchant for propaganda. If Cleopatra was wise, she would see which way the wind was blowing and stay the hell away from Pompey, who, again, was technically already allied with Ptolemy. Given that Pompey, historically, was already planning to flee to Egypt and ascertain the young Ptolemy's aid, it would have been smarter for her to wait until Caesar shows up and elicit his aid, since it can be assumed that he'll come after Pompey eventually, wherever he is. It paints Cleopatra as being somewhat aloof of the present geopolitical situation. If that's not the case, then it's another example of the writers diminishing her political shrewdness and cunning to that of someone who's just simply throwing herself at anyone with the means of helping her regain her throne without much consideration of the consequences. Yes, what remains of Pompey's forces would probably tip the scales in her favor in Egypt's civil war, and his allegiance to Ptolemy could be swayed with gold and a chance to tumble in the hay with her, but in so doing would make her an enemy of Caesar's, thus putting her in his crosshairs, and if history tells us anything, enemies of Caesar didn't tend to last very long. Now this, of course, is assuming such a meeting ever happened, of which there is no evidence, at least based on my research, and that fact alone does give this moment some legitimacy, but only if you ignore everything else transpiring around it historically. It also isn't helped by the fact that we have to defend Pompey from ships under Ptolemy's command, even though again, and I must stress this, Pompey and Ptolemy were already technically allies at this point, making this engagement highly unlikely. Iacta states that they're probably, possibly, almost certainly sent by the Order of Ancients to make sure Cleopatra's deal with Pompey never happens, though this begs the question of whether those Ptolemaic ships are acting on Ptolemy's orders, which is possible given the order's sway over him, or perhaps without the young pharaoh's knowledge. As mentioned earlier, this is the first of a handful of moments where we control Iacta, the majority of which take place aboard Phoxidus' trireme where we duke it out with enemy ships. They serve as a nice break from the usual song and dance with Bayek, offering something new and fresh, and are among my favorite moments in the entire game. So successful and well received were these sections that they were imported and reinvented into Odyssey, becoming a core component of that game's combat system and world navigation, a component that I absolutely love and will probably continue to love for years to come. Once we defeated the Ptolemaic/Order ships, we meet with Pompey, where I proposes Cleopatra's offer of alliance. The old general is at first skeptical, seeing clear through the fact the queen is offering gold for his favor and preference after he's won Rome, which, now that I say that, is another point in my argument against the logic of this meeting. Again, if this is after Pharsalus, Pompey, what the fuck are you talking about, winning Rome? Your army was smashed and at least 2/3 of your fleet surrendered to Caesar, along with most of your allies if they weren't already killed or captured after the battle. If you're winning anything, it's the race to see who visits Pluto first. Sure, maybe historically Pompey might have still believed he could win the civil war with Caesar, but he definitely wouldn't have said it with such confidence if such correspondence with Cleopatra took place, and that's a big if. Anyways, Iacta makes her case, showing a coin with Cleopatra's name on it, while asking if any Roman women have received the same honor, which is honestly a pretty good argument, before laying it plain. Cleopatra doesn't just want an ally, she wants a king. Understanding the benefits, Pompey accepts the queen's offer and agrees to sail to Egypt as soon as possible, at which point the game shifts back to Bayek, where we can continue on our merry way cutting the order into tiny little pieces. Next up is the hyena, who has set up shop somewhere in Giza. Just like the scarab, and all the other order members, in truth, very little is known about them, only that they control everything that happens there, Apollodorus calling it a land of death and loss, which now that I think about it doesn't really differentiate it much from the others, but we'll just run with it for now. In Giza, we meet with another of Polydorus' contacts, a man named Mered, who runs a shop in and around the ruins of the Great Sphinx and will only part with what he knows about the hyena after we pay him 100 drachmas, which, depending on how vociferous you've been with completing side quests or exploring, is probably going to be chump change for you. Even still, all he tells us is that the hyena is a woman named Khaliset, before asking that we retrieve his stolen horse before continuing, which makes me really wish this game had dialogue options like in Odyssey and Valhalla, so we could just threaten his sinewy ass for the information and be done with him. We're assisted by two of Mered's men, who themselves are tight-lipped about the hyena, though whether this is because of Mered or because of the threat Khaliset poses is unclear. My guess is probably both. In any event, we head to a nearby bandit camp, Mered of course failing to mention that bandits have it, where we take the horse back to Mered, where we find out that, of course, the horse isn't actually his. What a surprise. Here Mered will finally spill the beans on what he knows, though not before trying to eke out another favor from Bayek. Khaliset has been languishing somewhere in the hills overlooking Giza, roaming the desert and collecting silica, an oxide of silicon found commonly across the world as quartz. We also get a glimpse into what happens to people who interfere, willingly or not, with her work. What's interesting here is that the silica we see in Khaliset's possession is glowing with a golden yellow color, while silica usually, though coming in a variety of colors, is usually white or a greenish blue, and doesn't glow. This little detail isn't important right now, but keep it in mind for later. With this information, we set off into said hills to look for Khaliset.
Hey! That's my horse! You can't steal something already stolen, Mered.
The path of which takes us through the Giza Pyramid Complex, perhaps one of the most jaw-dropping set pieces in the entire game. While perhaps not as visually interesting as Alexandria, at least for me, I can't help but be awestruck and maybe a little intimidated every time I come here. The sheer magnitude of the three pyramids and the surrounding cemeteries brought to vivid life by the developers, their architectural and cultural significance casting an enormous literal and figurative shadow, both over its immediate surroundings and what they represent in ancient Egyptian culture. That latter point is perhaps best personified when we climb to the top of the Great Pyramid, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, where a synchronization point is located and we see the sheer magnitude on full display. The same can also be said for another one of the 7 wonders found in the game, the Pharos of Alexandria, the great lighthouse that dominates the city skyline and overlooks the port, though I personally find the Great Pyramid's vista more impressive. Despite their many issues, Ubisoft has continually proven to be adept when it comes to designing and incorporating set pieces into their worlds, a trend set well before Origins and continued in Odyssey. Valhalla though? We find Khaliset's hideaway in the hills and, what do you know, it's full of hyenas. How fitting. Once we've dealt with the wild puppers, we're free to begin our investigation. Khaliset isn't here, but we do find a prisoner begging and pleading not to be taken by her. We don't learn much, such as the man's terrified state, only that she left only hours before with other prisoners, presumably to have them sacrificed. We do get a lead in the form of a small diagram, that of the Great Pyramid, with special attention being paid to something below it. With this, we head back to the pyramid, the entrance into which is guarded by yet more hyenas, before heading inside. We don't even make it 2 steps inside before we're greeted by Khaliset somewhere deeper within, demanding we leave, calling our arrival an intrusion.
I demand that you stop here. Turn back now and I will excuse this intrusion.
But of what? To find out, we must head deeper in. While I can't claim to have explored all of the pyramids, they are all accessible and open to exploration. You can even return to the bent pyramid of Sneferu, where Bayek killed Rujek in the opening cinematic, to find that the naked Iadet has been buried there, much to Bayek's disgust. Exploring them to their very ends will net you a free ability point, as well as the chance to loot chests with level adjacent gear, along with a considerable amount of drachmas and basic loot that you can sell, and you can walk away from such excursions hundreds of drachmas richer, with the chance to earn quite a bit more after you sell said loot. On top of that, you can find numerous inscriptions to read, which offer a glimpse into ancient Egyptian culture, particularly that dating back to the time of the Old Kingdom in the case of the Giza pyramids, even if those inscriptions are, at least to a 21st century Westerner such as myself, a bit strange in their composition. Now, I must admit that I find delving into these pyramids, or any subterranean tombs for that matter, to be an almost spooky prospect, and I almost always feel tense as Bayek slinks through narrow passages and explores grandiose chambers brimming with treasure. This could largely be down to the stereotype that is often attributed to ancient Egyptian tombs. That of curses, cast upon those who would disturb the eternal rest of their long-dead occupants, be they looters, archaeologists, or a humble magi chasing after a crazy hyena lover. While stories of curses had existed long before, they were brought to popular Western attention and fascination with the death of Lord Carnarvon, chief financier of Howard Carter's excavation and opening of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, Lord Carnarvon dying 6 weeks after its opening. Before that, there had been a story reported in the New York Times stating Howard Carter's pet canary had been found to be eaten by a cobra that had mysteriously broken into his home near Luxor, the cobra being a symbol of the ancient Egyptian monarchy. While the notion of such curses has been routinely disproven, thanks in large part to the fact that no curses have been found inscribed on the tombs of pharaohs, along with certain evidence not lining up with the facts or timeline of events, their constant circulation since the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb has persisted to this day, leading to a sort of cultural zeitgeist pertaining to ancient Egypt that continues to linger in the collective imagination, especially in the West. On top of this is the sheer colossal weight of history that comes with these tombs. For perspective, 48 BC, the year in which Origins is set, is almost 2100 years in the past from our present era, and some 50-odd years before the birth of Jesus Christ. By that time, the Great Pyramid was already 2600 years old alone. Rudimentary archaeological digs and research were already being conducted hundreds of years before the events of the game, with the famous Greek historian Herodotus being among the first to mention the Great Pyramid in the second book of his work, The Histories, in the 5th century BC. These pyramids and tombs were already ancient to the ancients, and thus creates an intimidating aura that only grows stronger once you step within their often cramped confines, where having a torch is a must lest you be enveloped in darkness. It's in this sort of atmosphere that we must hunt down Khaliset, who's already conspiring some dark machinations involving prisoners and strangely glowing silica, making this already spooky dive into the Great Pyramid all the spookier. We follow a passage that takes us down below the base of the pyramid, as the diagram suggested, while Khaliset continues to bark at us from the shadows. At its end is a large chamber, unlike the one above where we can find Khufu's tomb, resembling nothing akin to ancient Egyptian architecture, with an ornate sarcophagus and strange glowing obelisk at its heart, projecting just as strange lights all around. We start to investigate the chamber, which is the scene of a recent sacrifice, the body still warm and blood everywhere, presumably one of the people mentioned by the terrified prisoner back in the hills. We also find strange symbols drawn on the floor, an offering to Osiris, the aforementioned god of the dead and other things, and strange symbols on the sarcophagus. It's clear that Khaliset was up to some strange dark magic fuckery here, all evidence suggesting that she's attempting to bring someone back to life. Opening the sarcophagus reveals the mummified body of a child, at which point Khaliset appears, revealing that it's her daughter. From here we have our final confrontation with her in a cemetery next to the Great Pyramid, but before we get to it, along with dissecting her actions and motivations, we need to talk about the glowing obelisk in the chamber. Interacting with it begins some sort of message, left by some unnamed messenger, discussing an event known as the Great Catastrophe, an event that presumably happened thousands of years earlier. This message may be your first interaction with the Isu, an incredibly complex race of powerful humanoids that has existed in one form or another since the first Assassin's Creed, and has had a heavy influence and participation in events across the entire series. Also known as the ones who came before, or the precursors, they ruled Earth thousands of years before the rise of the first proper human civilizations, creating technology and born with powers akin to powerful magic, including creating the human race itself. They were destroyed during the aforementioned Great Catastrophe, which was really a coronal mass ejection that wiped them and nearly humanity out, an event that would in modern times be attributed to the Toba supereruption around 75,000 years ago, leaving what remained of humanity to inherit the Earth. Despite their demise, the Isu's legacy lives on in myth and legend, becoming the focal point of many human religions, such as the Greek, Roman, and Norse mythologies. Case in point, as we'll learn in Valhalla, the story of Ragnarok, Norse mythology's ever-bombastic end times, is believed to have been inspired by the Great Catastrophe. Of course, this only scratches the surface regarding the Isu, and given my surface-level knowledge of earlier entries in the series up until Origins, I'll abstain from bringing them up unless absolutely necessary. And also because they're usually more pertinent to the modern-day storylines, which you already know my feelings on. With that said, I do find the idea of a precursor race influencing many major historical events, whether directly or indirectly, to be an interesting concept, and I do like how they're incorporated into the historical settings, even if their full scope is more directly tied to the utterly shitty modern-day sequences. This message in the Great Pyramid is incredibly cryptic and may not make any sense to you, especially if you're new to Assassin's Creed lore. This is in large part thanks to the fact that it is only one of 6 messages we can find across the game world, located in Isu temples. Admittedly, I haven't found all 6, but based on my research into the subject, they all talk about the concept of time, with the message in the Great Pyramid discussing how we, be it the player, Bayek, or Layla, can only comprehend it at the most basic level, such as reading a watch or calendars. That's because the Isu had a 6th sense, known simply as knowledge, and it's through this sense that they were able to essentially see the future and its many possibilities. This included the Great Catastrophe, which the Isu did everything they could to avoid, but failed, presumably only hastening their demise with their efforts, playing on the concept of the future being written, a concept that plays somewhat of a role in Odyssey, particularly in the Fate of Atlantis DLC, and is more sharply focused in Valhalla. As for Origins, we can more or less blissfully ignore it, though the presence of the Isu, and perhaps their most important creation, will become exponentially more important nearer towards the end of the story. Alright, Khaliset still needs killing, so let's get to that. Fighting Khaliset is perhaps one of the more unique boss battles in the entire game, taking place in a nearby cemetery. Now, by calling it unique, I don't mean interesting, as it mostly involves fighting her from range while a sandstorm rages and her hyenas prowl about, waiting for a chance to nibble Bayek's butt cheeks. You can get in close and use melee if you exercise extreme patience, but Khaliset will always make an effort to get away, either by just running or using a smoke bomb to disappear. Why I call it unique is because, despite its simplicity, it's still rather different from the usual boss encounters you'll find across the game, which are just basic brawls in arenas. Not too much to write home about, while I feel the fight with Khaliset is an attempt to break from this monotony, even if it proves to be somewhat shallow on its own. Upon killing her, we confront Khaliset in the Shadow Realm, where everything is laid out and made bare. In simplest terms, Khaliset was tasked by the Order to collect the glowing silica we saw earlier, which, unless I just missed it, we never see at all while tracking her down across Giza, save for those earlier cutscenes. While this last point is never directly mentioned here or during our search for Khaliset, the letter you receive from Gupo while hunting the Scarab references this circumstance. The glowing silica is needed to power some magic stone created by the Isu, though what this magic stone is and what it's for remains a mystery. At some point, this all changed, as Khaliset went rogue and started collecting the silica for her own purpose, to resurrect her long-dead daughter. What isn't made clear in Origins but is in Valhalla and its expansions is that the Isu used silica to store energy, hence why it glows, energy that was and is then used to power different devices and weapons. Khaliset believed that she could use the same power to resurrect her dead daughter, mixing in human sacrifice and offerings to Osiris. Nothing has worked so far, but that hasn't stopped her from trying, leading to a reign of terror over Giza. It begs the question, did she join the Order because they promised they could resurrect her daughter and she went rogue when progress became too slow? Or did she offer herself to the Order and plan to go rogue all along, only joining the Order to gain access to its vast wealth of resources? It's hard to say, and the scene in the Shadow Realm doesn't bring much clarity either. My guess is that it's a semblance of both. The Order promised her the chance to resurrect her daughter, but she planned to go her own way from the start, never truly believing what the Order stood for. They were just a means to an end. What she didn't anticipate was Bayek coming after her, and now all her plans are ruined, though it's made very clear that resurrection, even with the power of superhuman entities like the Isu, is not possible, nor should it be at all, especially in the hands of a malevolent organization like the Order of the Ancients. Ultimately, it seems Khaliset's desire to resurrect her daughter was nothing short of madness, a madness that ultimately blew up in her face, and leads to her being devoured by her own hyenas in the Duat, all for one simple but frankly understandable reason, which is why Bayek can only watch in contemplative silence as she's dragged away. I find myself wondering what's going through Bayek's head as this happens. Despite his admonishment of Khaliset for what he calls a selfish desire, knowing the lengths he's gone and continues to go to avenge Khemu, listening to her has probably left him asking a simple question. If he had the means and power to do so, would he do, or at the very least attempt to do, the same thing? What would he have done if he was in Khaliset's shoes? Maybe he isn't so much asking himself those questions, but perhaps, in the hyena's final moments, comes to understand what drove her, even if her modus operandi was, again, pure madness and depravity. I have no children of my own, and never want to, but I can appreciate the lengths parents will go to protect their children in life, never mind the lengths some might go to bring them back if they've sadly passed on. And having lost his own child, Bayek, in this moment, however brief it is, understands this, and understands Khaliset, I think. So ends the hyena and her reign of terror over most holy Giza, which means it's time for us to move on and continue our hunt. 2 down, 2 more to go. With the scarab and hyena dead, it's time to move on to our next target, the lizard. You may recall from our meeting with Cleopatra, this son of a bitch is presently operating in the city of Memphis, working some sort of diabolical powers, spreading all manner of curses, shrouding the city and its temples in shadow. This is made abundantly apparent upon reaching the ancient city, for once we set foot within its limits, the sky immediately goes dark, coupled with a strange ghostly mist that permeates across the city, and an odious stink akin to that found on battlefields or in tombs. Memphis had previously been the capital of Egypt during the days of the Old Kingdom, and even after the political capital was decentralized, it remained the beating heart of the pharaoh's authority, as they continued to come to Memphis to be crowned in the hopes of legitimizing their ascension to the throne, including Alexander the Great following his conquest of Egypt from the Achaemenid Persians. Despite waning in status and importance with the construction of Alexandria and its establishment as the Ptolemaic capital following Alexander's death, Memphis remained a significant religious and economic hub, the former due to the Temple of Ptah, god of creation, and the latter due to its ideal location along the banks of the Nile. The presence of the lizard and their diabolical machinations has cast all of this into doubt, both in the literal and spiritual sense. As mentioned before, they seem to have cursed the city, including the most sacred entity in Memphis and perhaps one of the most sacred entities in all of Egypt, the Apis bull. Pretty bad timing as well, as Cleopatra is due to visit the city as part of an effort to drum up support for her cause, though this invariably could all be connected to the lizard's actions. A declared enemy of the state due to visit most sacred Memphis and the city has fallen into shadow? Can't be a coincidence, right? Our hunt for the lizard begins at the Temple of Ptah, where we find Pasherenptah, High Priest of Ptah, who, you'll recall, was present at the aforementioned meeting with Cleopatra. Interestingly, Pasherenptah is actually an historical figure, not a creation of Ubisoft's writers, mentioned in 2 stelas presumably written by himself. Known as Pasherenptah III, he ascended to the position of High Priest in 76 BC at only 14 and held it until his death in 41 BC when he was succeeded by his son Imhotep Pedubast. While little else is known about him, save for the names of his children and his second wife, who we'll be meeting shortly, it's a minor example that just goes to show the lengths Ubisoft will go for historical accuracy, or, barring that, historical authenticity when it comes to creating these historical settings, and not just in Origins. We find Pasherenptah with his wife, or rather second wife historically, Imhotep, who's very visibly pregnant, but based on what we see, things are not so swell. We're then introduced to the Apis bull, where things are most definitely not swell, the poor animal clearly in distress. Don't tell PETA. It's then that Bayek appears and we're given the rundown on the situation in Memphis. By all accounts, disease and pestilence grips the city, explaining the deathly stench and foul mist enveloping it. The sickness has also afflicted the Apis bull, the poor beast sickened almost to the point of death, the animal collapsing after Pasherenptah removes its chained collar. The Apis bull, also known simply as the Apis, is revered in Memphis and considered to be the greatest of the 3 bull cults across Egypt, believed to be the son of Hathor, chief deity of the ancient Egyptians, and seen as the manifestation of the pharaoh, representing strength and fertility, qualities closely linked to the monarchy. With the Apis sickly and on the brink of death, the city has fallen into despair, their most sacred vessel, the means by which they commune with the gods, falling afoul of the curse that has befallen the city, an ill omen if there ever was one. In turn, the people have turned to Pasherenptah for guidance, but the poor man is just as lost as they. Compounding matters is that the curse has even touched his own home. As we just saw, his wife Imhotep is pregnant. Usually that would be cause for celebration. Except she's already miscarried 3 times in the past year, and Pasherenptah fears that a 4th would lead to her death along with the child's. Offering to help with this personal dilemma, we find Imhotep at the home of a seer from whom she's been seeking help, in the hopes of saving her unborn child from the ravages of the curse. We find them in the midst of a strange, almost chaotic ritual where we're thrown right into the confusing thick of it without warning, the seer apparently having waited years for Bayek's arrival, calling him the deliverer, which... okay, I guess?
Many years I have waited for him. What?
We're then made to drink a god knows what concoction, which knocks Bayek on his ass and the screen goes black. When we come back, we find Bayek in the middle of the desert, sandstorm raging, Imhotep, the seer, and her maid turn to ash. We get out of the storm by running into a rather spooky nearby temple where what the fuck is that?
Oh, hell no!
Pushing on, we enter a large chamber with a set of scales, where we see a clone of Bayek with our Bayek's heart in his hands, before the big nasty, a giant cobra, suddenly appears and swallows the heart. Senu then shows up and turns into a bow. We're then transported into another chamber, this time full of water, with a giant cobra slithering about menacingly. We're then suddenly thrust into the action as we sail around on a boat while the cobra makes every effort to render us unalive. The giant cobra in question is Apep, the scaly god of darkness and disorder, who, in ancient Egyptian mythology, was the direct antithesis and enemy of Ra, god of the sun and upholder of Ma'at, of law and order, earning the slithery fiend the titles Enemy of Ra and the Lord of Darkness. It was said that Apep's movements were the cause of earthquakes, while his battles with Set, god of deserts, storms, disorder, violence, and, strangely, foreigners, were the cause of thunderstorms. Our job is simple: defeat Apep and get our heart back. As to the significance of the bow, I'm not too sure, though given its glow, along with the arrows we shoot, my guess is that it's meant to personify Ra, thus making this dream battle a sort of reenactment of the many clashes between him and Apep. Eventually we defeat the scaly bastard, but in doing so are flung into the water. Bayek will swim to the bottom, which is really the top, but whatever, where we find a sarcophagus, in which he finds his heart. Shoving it back into his chest, we suddenly hear Khemu, before we're transported again, this time to a land where grain and tall grass stretches as far as the eye can see. This is Aru, the Field of Reeds, the heavenly place I mentioned back in part 1. But what on earth are we doing here? The answer comes in the form of Khemu? Father and son share a moment, but we never hear what's said, before the screen fades out and we're suddenly returned to the present, back to the seer's house. Apparently the ritual was a resounding success. Temhotep's child will live. The seer also saw the cause of the curse in the city. Someone's been poisoning the temple food with the flesh of the dead. How, you may ask? No idea, we just gotta run with it and move on. Honestly, I don't understand the point of this dream sequence, or how such a ritual is supposed to help Temhotep and her unborn child survive, or even reveal to the seer who or what is behind the curse waylaying Memphis and poisoning Temhotep, especially when everything already points to the lizard and, by extension, the Order being the cause of all the misery in the city. Maybe I'm grasping at straws here, or maybe the true meaning has flown over my head, but it almost feels like a pointless exercise, an excuse for the developers to throw in an epic boss fight that could have easily been done through a simple cutscene, with all the sequence's big moments cut together into a neatly put together package. It could also be that I'm just not a fan of dream sequences in stories like this. Valhalla, for example, has whole arcs dedicated to dream sequences that are, for me, the worst parts of the game, only slightly better than the god-awful modern-day sequences. Yes, the sequence is cool and exposes us to more aspects of ancient Egyptian culture and mythology, but at the cost of needlessly slowing things down, possibly in service to the concept of the rule of cool. In any event, we have a lead: the food at the temple. As we leave the seer's place, we're met by Aya, and together we head back to the temple to inform Pasha Remta of the situation, as well as look into the sickness laying the Apis low, for it would seem that which ails Temhotep is connected in some way to the bull. Taking a boat back, Bayek's informed of Cleopatra's imminent arrival, with Aya having come ahead to scope out the situation and aid Bayek, as well as seeing the first signs of the divide starting to grow between the couple. While still early, we can already see that Bayek and Aya's priorities have already started to go different directions. Bayek wants nothing more than to hunt the Order with Aya at his side and call it a day, while Aya's ambitions have taken on a far grander prospect, thanks in part to her service to Cleopatra having lifted her gaze to the horizon, suggesting that she has far grander plans beyond just defeating the Order and resettling into a quiet life. There's a strange awkwardness to this conversation, especially from Aya, who seems to be holding something back, and she almost intentionally changes the subject when she informs Bayek that she plans to leave Memphis after the lizard has been dealt with, and Bayek makes clear his desire to follow her. I can't really dive into what it all means yet, as we need to see this divide unfold some more before full context is achieved, so for now, just keep this conversation in the back of your mind, as it will become much more relevant later, though if you've been paying attention, you can probably see where they, and their relationship, is sadly heading. Returning to the temple, we begin to investigate the Apis bull's enclosure, while Aya speaks with the priestesses responsible for tending to the god beast, responsibilities that include feeding him. Now, you may be starting to wonder, but what about the deathly stink and disease emanating through the city? Isn't that part of the curse too? To that you'd be correct, except that despite being vitally important to the curse that has befallen Memphis, it's relegated to a few side quests almost as quickly as they're mentioned, involving poisoned cakes delivered to the temple for Temhotep, as well as the tampering of the mummification process involving sabotage natron. Natron being key to drawing out bodies so they don't rot, both instances pointing to the lizard and their machinations. Why they've been relegated to side quest status despite their inherent importance to the lizard's overall plans is unclear, my gut assumption being that the developers didn't want to overload the hunt for the lizard with bloat. despite that bloat supposedly being again vitally important to the main plot as it pertains to Memphis, which can make doing them a little weird if you've already taken care of the lizard. In any event, our search of the Apis' enclosure leads to a storehouse adjacent to the enclosure where the food is stored. Very quickly we find peach pits, which if ingested are poisonous, explaining the bull's sickness. Along with the pits we find a necklace, very similar to one worn by one of the priestesses who just so happened to be twins. Now, I can't help but wonder how it is that Bayek was able to jump to this conclusion when, to my knowledge, up until now we haven't even seen the twin priestesses, let alone interacted with them. Yet somehow Bayek just knows that the necklace we find with the peach pits is like the one worn by the priestesses before having an aha moment when we approach them as they speak with Aya and notice that one of them isn't wearing said necklace, thereby cracking the code. That aside, it also seems a pretty daft move by the priestesses to leave such an important clue behind to be found by a Magi. Yes, sometimes villains and their henchmen are stupid, and in the case of the priestesses, as we'll learn shortly, it may have happened in a panic given that they were actively poisoning a god. Even still, it comes off as a bit cheap, especially since all of the other hunts for Order members require more than just stumbling upon such blatant evidence through pure happenstance, and by being suddenly omniscient when he has no way of knowing beforehand. It makes me wonder if the developers had planned this investigation to be more involved or grandiose in its design, given its context and connotations, but scrapped it in service to that dream sequence with Tamotep, the Seer, and slithery snake boy Apep. If that's the case, and I must stress if, then I wish they had done away with the dream sequence, having Tamotep's situation tied instead to the tampered mummies and poisoning of cakes, thereby looping those quests back into the main crux of the hunt for the lizard. They could have had us meet the twin priestesses along the way, thereby making the whole bit with the necklace and the peach pits, their connection, and Bayek's sudden realization be more natural, make sense, and not come off as cheaply as it does. In any event, after Bayek's moment of omniscience, we confront the priestesses with the peach pits. They attempt to run, but don't make it very far, all but admitting that they did it on purpose. Not because they wanted to, but to save their brother Pancrates, who was kidnapped by bandits who sent his severed finger as a warning to the priestesses if they didn't do as they were told. Right away, we set off to the Temple of Hathor to rescue Pancrates, because apparently, despite the temple not even being mentioned by the priestesses, Aya somehow just knows that's where he is. It seems strange to me that bandits have just been able to commandeer the whole temple when it's situated very much within city limits, but since it's assumed that they're acting on the orders of the lizard, this may be a way of suggesting that they're in a position of authority and capable of making such things happen. Which turns out to be just the case, for after we rescue Pancrates and bring him home, he tells us that the man that abducted him is none other than a priest of Anubis at the Temple of Ptah, adding that he wears a blue scarf and has a terrible cough. With Pancrates reunited with his sisters, we return to the temple with Aya to inform Pasaremta of the situation, though not before listening to Cleopatra give a speech, one that's not well received by the populace. It would seem the lizard's work has done much to ruin the queen's reputation in the old capital, which may precisely be the point of it all, only feeling the need to find him and stick our hidden blade into his neck. Convening with the queen and Pasaremta, Bayek reveals this priest to be the lizard, the old priest giving him a name upon the revelation, Hatepi, adding that he's one of his closest advisors, which is more than a little perturbing to him. Nevertheless, they must end him here and now, before the queen has to leave. It must be noted that there's a degree of distaste from Bayek at the thought of having to take out yet another priest, Hatepi being the second after Madunamun in Siwa. Priests were seen in high regard across ancient Egypt's history, the highest among them often second only to the pharaoh in the religious hierarchy. They alone could perform certain religious rites and commune with the gods, and thus were seen essentially as bastions of the community wherever they resided. That two priests, one of Amun and now of Anubis, two major gods in the ancient Egyptian pantheon, could be behind such suffering and ill intent goes to show just how corrupt such a venerated pillar of such a society has become, despite individuals like Pasaremta and Menehet and Yamu trying their best. And this doesn't just extend to those related to the Order. In the Fayum, which we'll get to after we've dealt with the lizard, there's a side quest we can find involving a priest of Sobek relentlessly and cruelly beating his servant for stealing 2 gold statues of Sobek, despite the servant claiming they sank with the ship he was on. Upon investigating, we find that the servant was indeed telling the truth, with one of the statues even in the possession of some soldiers who found it during a dive. Retrieving them both, we return to the priest and call him out on his bullshit, only for the priest to knock the boy out with the statue, then call on soldiers to kill Bayek when he gives him a piece of his mind. The priest escapes unfortunately, but at least we save the servant from certain death, leaving him with the statues to do with as he pleases. A simple quest to be sure, but one that further highlights just how far the priesthood in Egypt has fallen, even without the Order's influence. This priest of Sobek, for example, given how he seems to covet the statues, is perhaps driven more by greed than their actual spiritual significance, using his position as a priest as a sort of mask. And this isn't just something specific to Origins. Odyssey and Valhalla are chock full of individuals with superior religious authority who use it to further their own ends, whether because they're simply crazed fanatics, or to simply fulfill more temporal yet equally twisted desires. Given that his life was spent protecting the Circle of Amun before starting his whirlwind revenge tour, killing priests, however necessary, clearly doesn't sit well with Bayek, though this could be a case of disillusionment rearing its head as he begins to see the moral corruption and decay that's taken hold amidst Egypt's most venerated order. Nevertheless, we have a job to do, and after Pasherenptah gives Bayek his blessing, we head for the Great Temple, where the priests of Anubis are presently performing rites. There is, however, one catch. A big one, in fact. Hetepi isn't the only one wearing a mask and a blue scarf, meaning that it's very possible that you can kill the wrong man. Which made it almost hilarious that, in my recorded session, the very first priest I came across started hacking up a lung, giving himself away. In the Shadow Realm, Hetepi will claim that he did everything he did in the name of Old Egypt, in the name of the old ways. The why is never really explained, though given what he says here, he possibly had hoped to overthrow Pasherenptah as High Priest, thereby taking over the temple and using its power and influence to expand the Order's own, and his by extension. He also has a very low opinion of the people, not just of Memphis but the whole of Egypt, referring to them as cattle, driven by the herdsman's whip, be it the gods or the priests. He even goes so far as to refer to Bayek as one which, in hindsight, is a somewhat fair evaluation, even if Bayek, or we for that matter, don't really know it yet. After all, Bayek isn't just killing Order members to satisfy his lust for revenge, but also in service to a queen who sees them as a threat to her power, using Bayek's ulterior motive as an added bonus of sorts. Bayek may not fully realize it yet, but his killings are as much in service to the whims of a monarch as they are to his own personal motivations and the good of Egypt. In any event, we send Hetepi on his way, then return to Pasherenptah and Cleopatra to give them the good news. With all that settled, the Festival of Apis, delayed due to the bull's poor health, can finally begin, which we get to see a portion of, the people singing their praises for Cleopatra all the while. With Memphis now secure, it's time for Bayek to move on, as it is for Aya, who must return north and set the Sea of Flame, though not before the couple spend the night together. Now it's time to hunt the crocodile, who set up shop in the Fayum, on the shores of Lake Moeris. There we need to meet with Apollodorus' informant in the region, a man named Hotefres, who's been actively investigating and undermining the crocodile's operations. Like everywhere else, the Order's been up to all sorts of bullshittery and mischief, to put it mildly, though in the Fayum, it's taken on an almost twisted racial edge. Back in part 2, I talked about how Alexandria was the epicenter of constant tensions between the ruling minority Greeks and the majority yet often disenfranchised native Egyptians, due to their economic and political disparity. In the Fayum, this tension has been amplified by a million, with the Greeks practically in control of every aspect of economic, cultural, and political life in the region, centered around the city of Crocodilopolis, while the native Egyptians are left disenfranchised and oppressed, often violently, forced to live in dirt-poor slums, constantly harassed by Ptolemy XIII's soldiers. And this isn't just some barely concealed state of being that occasionally flares up to the surface, but an overt and blatant policy enacted by the gnomes' hegemons. This can be seen right from the get-go when we arrive in the town of Snoknopai Nessos, where we can hear a Greek town crier haranguing about the greatness of Greek culture and innovation in the Fayum, alongside the segregation of the native Egyptian population from Greeks for the latter's security, and how such blatantly racist policies are good for all. Why this is happening in the Fayum and not in Alexandria, I think, can be attributed to the presence of scholars and artists like Phanos, who see the Ptolemaic regime for what it is, and while they frankly haven't done much to try and improve the lot of native Egyptians in the capital, not at least from what I've seen, their respect for Egyptian culture and disavowalment of the pharaoh has, perhaps, somewhat united Greek and Egyptian in common cause. It goes to show the power intelligentsia can have on a society, an intelligentsia that's absent from the Fayum, allowing the racist Greeks in the region to enact their discriminatory policies without much concern or internal resistance. Where the crocodile fits into this equation is the big question, but considering that oppression, violence, and mayhem follows wherever the Order goes, it stands to reason that they have an equally major and heavy hand in what's happening here. Our search for Hotefres begins in Snoknopai Nessos, where he has a bureau. Arriving at the bureau, we find the place ransacked, along with the ominous scenes of a slain dog and a spear driven through a child's doll. In our search, we find some scrolls seemingly hidden on top of a pigeon coop, where we learn that Hotefres has been discovered by the crocodile's lackeys and that one of his servants has been arrested. We go to a nearby camp and rescue the servant, who tells us that Hotephres took a trading ship out onto the lake, presumably to escape the wrath of the crocodile, but mercenaries are presently on his tail. We find Hotephres' ship and finally meet the man himself, finding that he's already taken care of the mercenaries. For now anyways. After a short standoff, Hotephres not trusting Bayek initially, the two men get down to business, Hotephres giving Bayek the rundown on the situation in the Fayum, which we've already discussed. Hotephres is an interesting, if a bit underdeveloped character, though unlike some of Apollodorus' other contacts, he, in a roundabout way, has his own dedicated questline outside of our hunt for the crocodile. He's also seen as something of a healthy example of blending Egyptian and Greek culture. As you can see, he's Greek, yet has an Egyptian name, an intentional choice made by his father, who was a well-respected man in the region. He's also married to an Egyptian woman named Khenut, the two of them even having a daughter named Shadia, the two of whom we'll be meeting in a short bit. Hotephres has managed to steal a ledger from a Greek magistrate he suspects of corruption, which should reveal the identity of the crocodile and perhaps everyone else in the Order. In other words, an exceedingly damning document that, if put in the hands of a well-connected man like Apollodorus, could lead to the Order's destruction. It's for this reason that Hotephres is being hunted. To protect his family and to mislead the crocodile's attack dogs, he's given it to his wife to hide. As he puts it, so long as the Ptolemies, and by extension the Order, thinks that he has it, his family remains safe, at the cost of having to remain on the move and constantly on guard. At his suggestion, we head to the town of Euhemeria to meet with Khenut, who runs an alms kitchen for the needy, giving Bayek a doll to give to Shadia as proof of who he is and his intentions. What seems really strange to me, and may be a bit of a plot hole, is that, despite having presumably stolen the ledger himself, Hotephres doesn't know the identity of the crocodile, suggesting that he hasn't read the contents of the ledger. Now, to be fair, we have no way of knowing how long it's been since he stole the ledger and was found out by the crocodile, but given what we learned from Khenut in Euhemeria, it's probably been at least a few weeks. Surely, before giving it to Khenut to hide, he would have taken a little sneaky-beaky look at its contents and made, at the very least, a special note regarding the crocodile's own identity. Perhaps, given its contents, he figured it too hot to handle and thus sought to hide it as quickly as possible until someone like Bayek came along, someone who could make better use of the information than he could. It could also be that the theft is very recent and I'm just misconstruing what Khenut tells us. When we meet her at the kitchen, she tells us that she's been summoned to the local lighthouse for another routine investigation, something that, by the sounds of it, has been ongoing for some time, perhaps far longer than since when the theft happened. If that's the case, with the crocodile hot on his trail, Hotephres may simply not have had time to look over the ledger, even quickly, and thus had to hide it right away. In any event, it's left to us and Bayek to find the ledger. We learn of its whereabouts from Khenut, who had a servant hide it in the family villa in town, despite it being routinely searched by soldiers. It's also here we meet Shadia, Hotephres and Khenut's daughter, who's just so goddamn adorable that if anything were to happen to her, the whole of Egypt would burn. Surely nothing horrible and evil could happen to such a sweet little girl. Right? Due to the routine investigations, Khenut can't take us to the villa, so it's up to Shadia instead to take us there. Bayek is rightfully concerned about this investigation, considering the soldiers in the Fayum are presumably working for the crocodile, but Khenut assures him that they're nothing to worry about, that they happen all the time, and that they wouldn't harm an official like her. Anyways, we follow Shadia to just outside the villa, which, as expected, is crawling with soldiers, at which point Bayek sends Shadia back to her mother. We search the villa but find no ledger. In its place is a note left by Shadia, saying that she took the ledger with her. And we just sent her back to her mother, who's about to be taken by soldiers to the lighthouse. Oh, fuck. Leaving the villa, we race back to the kitchen, only to find Khenut and Shadia are gone, the little one also having been taken to the lighthouse despite Khenut's protestations. And if you're like me, you'll no doubt start to get a deep sinking feeling in the pit of your stomach. At the foot of the lighthouse lies a camp, where we can listen in on a conversation between two soldiers and gather that the worst has come to pass. We can also see Khenut kneeling at the end of a nearby pier, but no Shadia in sight. Upon dealing with the soldiers in the camp, we reach Khenut on the pier, who can only sob and call out Shadia's name, all while looking out over the water. It's then that we're prompted to head into the water to find Shadia. In a story full of cruelty and depravity, this moment continues to stick with me. Hell, haunt me even. From the moment of realization as to what Shadia had done, to the building tension as we race, first to the kitchen, then to the lighthouse, to the little one's fate, even if heartbreakingly expected by then, not just being intimated or suggested through clever cuts and edits, but shown, full stop, where other games may not have. That the all-important ledger, the very document that could have upended the Order in its entirety, has also been lost immediately doesn't matter, the complexion of the hunt for the crocodile becoming even more sinister than it already was. If the crocodile is willing to drown children over sheets of papyri, then who knows what else they may be willing to do. There's also a sickeningly twisted irony to this moment as well. Earlier I mentioned how Bayek expressed concern for Khenut coming to the lighthouse for the routine investigations, to which Khenut assured him that he had nothing to worry about, that they wouldn't hurt an official like her. In the end, she was partially correct. They didn't hurt her, not physically anyways. They just ripped her goddamn soul out. At some point, Hotaphres will show up and speak with Bayek, and we see a man who, despite trying his best to remain strong for a shattered wife, sounds clearly broken, admitting defeat in the face of the crocodile's cruelty and loss of the ledger. Even still, he vows to help Bayek however he can, including providing a crucial piece of information that he learned from Khenut off-screen, that there were other men with the soldiers, large and imposing, with one of them being a redhead. Hotaphres believes them to be gladiators fighting in the arena in Crocodilopolis, moonlighting as the crocodile's murderous thugs. It may not be much of a lead, but with the ledger gone, it's better than nothing. It's at this point that Hotaphres leaves with Khenut, the two moving to their estate in the village of Philadelphia to mourn and rebuild their lives, though this isn't the end of their story. Once we've defeated the crocodile, we can find them later in said village, still in mourning, in their own way, where we can help them through the process of overcoming Shadia's death. How, you may ask? By taking down corrupt Ptolemaic officials and aiding local rebel forces in the region, actions largely taken by Khenut, as Hotaphres has more or less given up, but comes around upon seeing his wife take a stand. Shadia may be gone, but they can still at least do some good in the Fayum, if for no other reason than to honor her memory. South of Philadelphia and southeast of Euhemeria, across the lake, lies the aforementioned city of Crocodilopolis, the Fayum's largest city, capital of the Nome, and the epicenter of the discriminatory policies of the Greek ruling class. Previously known by its Egyptian name of Shedet, its name was changed to its present Greek one due to being the home of a large temple dedicated to the crocodile god Sobek. For this reason, and as the name would suggest, Crocodilopolis literally means crocodile city, an inventive lot the Greeks when it comes to names. In keeping with the crocodile theme, most of the side quests revolve around the scaly beasts and their place within the culture of the city and Nome as a whole, including the tame crocodile kept at the temple known as Petsuchos, who, like the Apis, is seen as a living embodiment of their patron god. Alternatively, a few side quests are centered around the gladiatorial arena in the city and culture around it, the arena just happening to be where we need to head to next in our search for Shadia's supposed killers. Initially, I found the presence of a gladiatorial arena, which is built out of the ruins of an old temple, perhaps another symbolic representation of the slow disintegration of Egypt's old religious order in a mostly Greek city, to be somewhat confusing. While combat sports such as wrestling, boxing, and the mixed martial arts-esque sport of pankration were popular in ancient Greece, such as at the Olympic or Delphic Games, mortal combat sports such as gladiatorial fights were non-existent. Those were a creation of the Romans, who may have been inspired by the Etruscans or Companions, how very Roman, taking other cultures' ideas and making them their own, turning it into highly structured and regulated events, as well as being a lucrative business, with some gladiators, alongside chariot racers, becoming the Ronaldos, Messis, and LeBrons of the day. By 48 BC, it became, in essence, Rome's national sport, done at festivals, funerals, celebrations, such as after military conquests and victories, or merely as a means to distract the populace, especially if, during the Roman Empire, an unpopular emperor was looking to curry favor with the masses, especially in Rome itself. You may already be familiar with the phrase "bred in circuses," as quoted by the 1st century Roman poet Juvenal. But none of that answers what a gladiatorial arena is doing in a mostly Greek city. What gives? Well, despite my bloviating, the answer is not that exciting. The owner-operator is a Roman, Felix Martialis, a rather crusty individual who can't seem to stop spitting after every sentence. The Fayum seems an odd and out-of-the-way place to set up a gladiatorial arena, but by all accounts, despite some Greeks seeing it as nothing more than a barbaric blood sport, many have seemed to taken it with some gusto, either for the pure entertainment of it, or simply to make money, either through betting or actively participating. Our search for Shadia's murderers begins here, and we quickly learn the identities of the presumed culprits, the aforementioned gladiators Hotaphres mentioned and suspects. Diovikos and Viridovix, 2 brothers from Gaul, an ancient Celtic land that encompassed present-day France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and parts of Switzerland. These 2 brothers, often simply referred to as the Gallic brothers, are the kings of the Crocodilopolis arena, being the end of many aspiring champions. They even have statues of them outside the arena's main entrance. And it just so happens, as we learn from an arena employee, that one of them has red hair. Interesting. Looks like we just need to get into the arena, but Felix wants nothing to do with Bayek, saying he already has an Egyptian, a huntress from Siwa, who frequents an obelisk on the other side of town. A huntress from Siwa, you say, dear Felix? Okay. We leave the arena to find this mysterious huntress, Felix's assistant adding, before we go, that we can get in if we have an already active gladiator vouch for us. Sounds simple enough, and for once it actually is, for the huntress in question is Kensa, a new and unknown character to us, but an old friend to Bayek, with the story of how she ended up a gladiator being revealed in an optional conversation we can have once we're inside the arena's antechamber. In short, during Ptolemy XIII's infamous visit to Siwa the year before, she was captured and made a slave by another Roman named Septimius, but managed to escape and flee to Crocodilopolis, where she met Felix, who took her in and trained her. She's in essence a direct foil to Bayek. While Bayek wishes to set the world right and see all of its ills destroyed, Kensa doesn't much care for good or evil, right and wrong. She just wants glory, riches, and fame, and doesn't much care about the past, which is understandable given her time as a slave. She quickly assumes that Bayek is after the same thing, giving up his heroic quest to do good in the world, which is something Bayek goes along with, keeping his true intent close to his chest. Unfortunately, not telling Kensa the truth will cause problems further down the line, problems that could have easily been avoided, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. For now, all we need to do is meet with her in front of the arena, where she vouches for us to Felix. Luckily, a spot has just opened up and we're cleared to enter. After Felix gives us a brief tour and goes over the rules, such as having to use weapons provided to us, not our own, and quickly spar with Kensa, we can begin our first match. The matches in question are nothing really to write home about. All we gotta do is cut down every poor bastard that gets thrown into the arena, with each of the 3 rounds ramping up in difficulty as we progress. Kensa will be partnered with us for all but the last one, the huntress mysteriously disappearing right before, Felix stating her talents are required elsewhere. In between rounds, we can speak to another fighter and a trainer named Horus, who had his poor brain scrambled by the brothers, and ask about what they know regarding the brothers, work for gladiators outside the arena, and the shadowy patron or patrons behind such work. After completing these 3 rounds, we'll have finally earned our chance to square off against the brothers, who we even have a brief run-in with right after sparring with Kensa before the main event. Fighting the brothers is fairly straightforward on paper, but can be even easier if you speak with Horus beforehand, who gives us a crucial piece of advice. Keep them separated, as they fight stronger together. Let Kensa handle one while you deal with the other, then double team the remaining brother when the other is down. Eventually we take the brothers down, much to everyone's astonishment. It's also here that Bayek drops the facade he's been wearing and immediately interrogates the brothers, while Felix begins to announce to the crowd in the background. Bayek accuses the brothers of Shadia's murder, but the brothers profess their innocence. For all the terrible things they've done, they swear killing children is not one of them. They confess to being at the lighthouse when it happened, but by all accounts they refuse to do the deed, the act instead being committed by a woman named Berenike, whom they identify as the Crocodile. But just who the hell is this Berenike, a woman who seems to have just popped out of nowhere? In short, she's the nomarch of the Fayum, and the source of all the pain and misery taking place there. It's by her word that all we've seen, the discrimination of native Egyptians, the brutality of the soldiers, the routine investigations, the murder of a little girl, has taken place, all in the name of the region's so-called prosperity. The cruel hand orchestrating the Order's operations here. We'll discuss her more a little later when she gets her comeuppance, but again I have to mention the fact that she just sort of appears out of nowhere. She can be seen in certain cutscenes while we're in the arena, but the scenes in question offer little if any suggestion that she's the Crocodile. That in and of itself isn't a problem, but that we haven't heard of her before now kind of is. It makes the revelation that she's the big bad in the Fayum seem a little jarring and a little out of left field, though this all stems back to a larger problem within the game's narrative that we'll touch on in the next part. It's also here that Kensa, now aware of Bayek's true reason for wanting into the arena, demands to know why Bayek didn't confide in her, to which Bayek responds that, to him, she's just another mercenary, like the brothers, and that he couldn't take the risk. With all that said, I do feel Bayek could have handled the situation better, starting back at the obelisk where we first meet Kensa. Without prior knowledge of events preceding the events of the game, it's assumed Bayek and Kensa were fast friends long before. Sure, quite a bit of time has passed since then, and personal priorities will have no doubt changed, but I can't imagine a sense of distrust immediately forming. Yes, Bayek's mission is a very sensitive one, it goes without saying, but Kensa is still a friend, one that he presumably trusts, even if only a little. He could have tested the waters slightly, telling Kensa that he was after someone in the arena and leave it at that, then perhaps drip feed information as time went on if he felt Kensa was truly worthy of complete trust, instead of just jumping to conclusions. It could be that Bayek's decision to remain tight-lipped is driven by his desire to avenge Shadia and not complicate things, but this slight change would have spared them both the awkwardness of the moment, which will only continue to unfold a little later. Leaving the arena, we're met by Hotefres, who informs us that Berenike will most likely be at her estate, Kirkasucha Granary, where she wines and dines others of influence in the region and courts their favor with bribes and silver words. With this information, we head straight for Kirkasucha, where we find Berenike and Kensa, who's been named the Nomarch's champion and personal bodyguard. We inevitably have to fight her, though in my footage I killed Berenike first, then hit Kensa with an assassination combo, so unfortunately we won't get to see the conversation they have while fighting. That said, killing her isn't required to complete the mission, and it can be found later on a scroll that she continued to fight as a gladiator in Crocodilopolis, which suggests she survives the encounter regardless. In any event, we kill Berenike and are taken to the Shadow Realm, where we finally converse with the old Nomarch, in what is perhaps my favorite of all these scenes. Berenike is very much like the others, claiming that everything she did was necessary, but unlike the others we've taken down so far, she maintains a stoic, almost regal poise, even as she stares down Judgment and the Duat, even goading Bayek somewhat by being a little Snoop Dogg and asking who when Bayek mentions Shadia's name. There's no lamenting, no remorse, no begging for us to understand, only disappointment at Bayek's supposed failure to understand. It really sets Berenike apart from the others, and makes me really wish we got to see more of her prior to this moment, for I feel there's a lot more complexity to her character that could have been explored. It's this sinister dismissiveness, I think, that really sets Bayek off here. Berenike personally killed an innocent child, and yet all the old Nomarch does when faced with this reality is just shrug. It's for this reason that Bayek begins and ends the scene by making sure she remembers one name and one name alone. So ends the crocodile, but before we move on, I want to take a moment to discuss how the Order members we've offed so far serve as exemplars of the type of people that make up this shadowy organization. In essence, we've now seen the two sides of the coin that make up the Order. Those who are drawn in by the promise of fulfilled ambition or desire, and those who already have power and see the Order as a means to either secure it more effectively or wield it more efficiently and covertly. This is something that's fairly consistent across the series. The Templar Order and the Cult of Cosmos in Odyssey seeing this dichotomy in what would seem opposed end goals, a dichotomy that would perhaps, at least at first viewing, give rise to rifts in such organizations. By all accounts, Taharka joined the Order only because they promised the resources necessary to achieve his vision of a lasting legacy, at the presumed cost of his morality, as evidenced by his final words to Bayek. Khaliset falls into this same vein, presumably only joining the Order to gain the necessary resources to hopefully bring her daughter back from the dead. Unlike Taharka, who seems to have at least agreed with some of the Order's goals, if a bit reluctantly, her isolationism suggests that she only saw them as a means to an end. Compare that to Berenike, who already had considerable power as a Nomarch, and probably didn't need the Order to fulfill her ambitions, but saw the Order as means to secure her position, her remorseless dismissiveness in her last moments in the Shadow Realm possible evidence to that effect. Atepi is a bit tougher to pin down, as he wanted to overthrow Pasharemtov for the title of Grand Priest, but already had an esteemed position as Priest of Anubis. He could just be a rare case of being both, though his lack of remorse in death has me leaning towards slotting him in with Berenike. These differences would again suggest future conflicts and rifts within the Order down the road, and yet it somehow unites the Order more than it divides, just like with its successor, the Templar Order. It perhaps highlights a particular strength that these organizations have over their rivals: flexibility. They don't care what your reasons are, so long as you work to further the Order's goals and remain loyal. This dichotomy does tend to get blurred the further up the chain you go, but it's an aspect that I find particularly fascinating, especially when their overall mantra is that of total control, where any deviation from established doctrine and dogma is often seen as antithetical. Before we can move on after Berenike's deserved unaliving, we're dragged back to Layla in the modern day. Oh, for God's sakes. Alright, let's make this quick. Layla is forced out of the Animus by a screaming D. One thing to know about Layla's escapades is that she's doing this under the noses of her bosses at Abstergo. Now they found out and they've shown up to ruin her day, including going after D. As Layla, we skulk around and take out Abstergo agents. Don't get caught though, because if they find you, they'll one-shot your ass. Once we've taken them out, we hear over the radio that Dee's either been killed or knocked out. It's not entirely clear, which leaves Layla more than a little aggrieved. We then jump back into the Animus and return to Bayek. Right away, we receive a letter from Aya, who gives us some bad news. Turns out the Order members we've hunted down were not Khemu's killers, and that 2 more names have cropped up: the Scorpion and the Jackal. With this, and after we've taken care of any unfinished business in the Fayum, we're directed to head to Heraklion in the north, to rejoin Aya and Cleopatra, and hopefully, finally, put the Order of Ancients to bed. Let's take a moment and talk about characters for a bit. Origins, on the whole, does a wonderful job of fleshing out its vast array of characters, with each of them standing out in their own unique way, breathing life into the narrative and keeping things relatively fresh throughout. This goes for both the main narrative and side quests, some of whom I feel are among the best in the Ancients trilogy, further aided by the well-written dialogue and the performances of its many actors, even if a sizable chunk of the dialogue sequences, especially in side quests, aren't really cutscenes, but just 2 or more characters standing and talking, with little in the way of true expression. Similar in how Ghost of Tsushima, a game that came out 3 years later and whose narrative we've already covered in another video, does a lot of dialogue sequences. Now, you're probably thinking, okay, simple enough, a bit of praise, a bit of criticism, but that doesn't really constitute a whole dedicated conversation, so what gives? Well, the reason I bring up characters is that Origins has a bit more of a serious problem with them, one that I mentioned very briefly towards the end of Part 1, and a little bit when it came to Bereniki towards the end of Part 4. And that's how characters are introduced and utilized. In plain terms, Origins does an often horrible job of introducing characters at times, but it even goes beyond that, especially when they tie into the main story. Some characters have a tendency to just pop in, seemingly out of nowhere, with little in the way of a proper introduction. By extension, some tend to just disappear, sometimes as quickly as they appear. Now by that I don't mean they just disappear into the void and are never seen again, but that they're given so much importance to the overall plot, and then all of a sudden they just stop mattering. There's no escalation to their involvement, no further depth added. Sure, they may appear in cutscenes from time to time, but they feel more like flies on the wall, just happy to be there and hanging out with the lads and lasses without much more to add. There are also characters that will suddenly appear without much warning, with the apparent tag of being super important, but are quickly relegated to being barely noteworthy despite the game's attempt to suggest otherwise, and may even be killed off entirely. There are 2 characters we'll meet at the very end who fit this bill, though I think in their case this was intentional. Perhaps the worst example is a particular character who will show up in the main story, but only in cutscenes, and depending on how much of the side content you've completed, may just appear out of nowhere and leave you wondering just who the hell she is. In and around Heraklion, we can run into another old friend of Bayek's, a woman named Tahira, who, after the events of Siwa a year prior, set off on her own crusade as a protector, though instead of protecting people, she protects the wildlife from the encroachment of Roman poachers. This begins a short series of side quests combating Roman poachers who have set up shop in the region, first by rescuing a massive white crocodile from their captivity, then taking down their hunting parties. After this, we bid Tahira farewell as she decides to follow Sobek's children into the green. Later in the main story, after a series of convoluted and haphazardous events, some of our allies will gather, including Tahira, who will just seem to appear out of nowhere despite having no involvement in the main story prior. That in and of itself isn't a problem if you've completed her short story arc. But if you haven't, then you may be left wondering just who the hell she is and what her involvement in the main story is that constitutes her being at this very important meeting of minds. Now you may be thinking this isn't a big deal because most players will complete the side content. Open world games often encourage you completed side content, as they should, they're often where the main meat of a game is found after all, but given that they're optional, the main story shouldn't rely on them wholesale for certain instances to make sense. Thanos, for example, may only have a small part to play in the main story at the beginning, with his arc mostly fleshed out in side quests we get in Alexandria, but at least he plays enough of a role and has direct connections to certain characters to warrant being at this later meeting. Had the writers somehow wrapped working with Tahira into the main story, perhaps as a means by Cleopatra to further ingratiate herself with the people of Egypt by protecting its most sacred animals, then there'd be no problem. Alas, that's not the case, and you may be left beyond confused by the presence of this hooded woman if you didn't approach the game's side content as the developers intended, which, it could be argued, stands in contention with how open world games should operate. What further compounds Tahira's case is that she ends up playing a pivotal role in the Hidden Ones DLC, which, again, if you haven't approached the base game's side content in the way the developers intended, could leave you very confused and wondering what she did before to warrant her sudden inclusion, which may even still be true if you did. Thankfully, Odyssey seems to have addressed this problem, while Valhalla, I don't even know, it's really weird how it handles characters. Arriving in Heraklion, we meet with Cleopatra and Apollodorus, with Bayek eager to hash things out. The revelation that there are still 2 more Order names has left him more than a little frustrated, as none of those we killed were behind Khemu's death, and he's starting to wonder what the point of it all was. Unlike Aya, he hasn't been swayed by the royal intrigue at the heart of the civil war. He just wants to avenge Khemu, to send his Ka, or soul, to the afterlife, not get wrapped up in Cleopatra's schemes. That's not to say he doesn't believe his work has been important. Given what we've seen, it's clear that the Order is a threat to the entire nation and must be eliminated. The real question is, who does these assassinations really benefit? Egypt, or just Cleopatra? Cleopatra argues that they're one and the same. The Order are just as much her enemies as they're Egypt's, and she continues to couch the civil war as a whole in those terms, but I think this is the point where Bayek begins to slowly realize that that may not be entirely true, even if only a little, and that's assuming he believed to begin with, which is dubious at best. In any event, we still got 2 names to take care of, the Jackal and the Scorpion. While Aya continues to defend the seas with Cleopatra's fleet in preparation for Pompey's imminent arrival, Bayek must deal with another problem. While we were away, there was an attempt on Cleopatra's life, one she believes was orchestrated by the Jackal and Scorpion, who are part of Ptolemy XIII's inner circle. We're also introduced to the Gabiniani, a 2,000-strong force of Roman mercenaries led by one Lucius Septimius. If that name sounds familiar, he was the man who took Kensa as a slave after the events of Siwa the year prior. He also happens to be a member of the Order of Ancients, more specifically the Jackal, a particular detail that's just thrown out there with a little pomp and circumstance, but whatever. The Gabiniani themselves have a rather fascinating history, though very little of it, if any, is revealed here. 10 years prior, Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII's father, Ptolemy XII Auletes, was forced into exile in Rome after a popular revolt. He regained the throne 3 years later with the help of Aulus Gabinius, proconsul or governor of Roman Syria. After a short campaign, Gabinius left a part of his army, numbering 2,000 legionnaires and 500 cavalry, in Egypt for the king's protection. This small force would become known as the Gabiniani, Roman mercenaries loyal to Ptolemy XII and his descendants, eventually adopting the Alexandrian way of life and abandoning their connection to Rome, even marrying and fathering children with Egyptian women. It should also be noted as well that, because of his Roman support, as well as having strong, long-running pro-Roman policies, that Ptolemy XII made the people of Rome the executors of his will, which was approved by none other than Pompey, the very same will that stipulated that Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII share power, and we all know how that's going. Cleopatra mentions before we interrogate a Gabiniani prisoner that she had hoped to ally with them, but this is either a small historical error on the part of the writers, or she's just conveniently forgotten that they already hated her guts for some time prior to this moment. This stems from a moment prior to her ousting as queen, when the Gabiniani murdered 2 sons of Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, Roman governor of Syria, after they had been sent to acquire the Gabiniani services in Rome's ongoing war with the Parthians. Keeping in line with her father's pro-Roman policies, Cleopatra had the murderers arrested and sent to Bibulus in chains, which immediately turned the Gabiniani against her. Historian Christoph Schaefer believes that this breakdown in relations was what ultimately led to Cleopatra being forced to flee Egypt, as they sided with Ptolemy XIII and his advisors in the coup that eventually took place. We don't get much out of the interrogation, only bits and bobs about fucking some twins and another Gabiniani known as Venator, an associate of Septimius's. With this information, we head to the brothel in town and begin our investigation. After speaking with the brothel owner, we speak with the aforementioned twins, who look more than a little beat up, informing us of where Venator is staying. Heading to his lodges, we learn that he's been training his fellow mercs to assassinate Cleopatra, along with a fairly elaborate plan to do it, involving arson, an arrow, and a cross-dresser. We then set about foiling this plan, taking down all 3 participants in the plot, save for Venator, who's still nowhere to be found. When it's all said and done, we return to the palace, where we once again are reunited with Aya. Before we can truly celebrate a job well done, however, Venator and his goons suddenly attack the palace, the big bastard himself making an appearance after we take care of said goons. Eventually we take the big bastard down, but we still got no time to celebrate. It seems that the Gabiniani and Septimius are accelerating their plans, which means we have to accelerate our own. We can't wait for Pompey to come for us. we need to go to him, preferably before Septimius does. Bayek and I are ordered to go ahead and make sure this doesn't happen, and together we cross the nearby lagoon to where Pompey and his forces are meant to land. Along the way, we see the divide that has been plaguing the couple's relationship grow even wider and deeper. By now, Aya has become more or less consumed by her duties to Cleopatra, fully committed to her cause, while Bayek just wants to get on with killing nefarious naked Iacta and going home. Aya wants greatness, and what better place to get that than serving directly under the queen of a powerful, influential, and ancient land such as Egypt. It's far better, at least in her view, than what they as Magi have been doing before. Serving no one, for a cause that, as sad as it is, no longer exists. As parents. She is, however, forgetting one thing, which Bai keenly reminds her of. Cleopatra is as much a Ptolemy as her brother. Who's to say she'll be any better when she takes the throne, if she takes the throne? As Bayek puts it, she's the better of two evils. Of course, as of this moment, neither we nor Bayek have much evidence to suggest that she will be, the only noticeable bit being when she immediately ordered the twin priestesses in Memphis be thrown into a brazen bull before Bayek could explain the truth of the matter, thus sparing the sisters. That being said, given Cleopatra's penchant for the royal schemes and courtly intrigues synonymous with the Ptolemaic dynasty, it's not a wholly unreasonable concern, one that Aya is either oblivious to or perhaps is taken to with her characteristic vigor. On the flip side, it could be said that Bayek is desperately trying to hold on to a past and world that no longer exists, or is perhaps at the very least well on its way out. A key point that gets brought up quite regularly is that Bayek is not just a Magi, but the last Magi. I know this seems very odd and out of left field, as I've referred to Aya and his friend Hepzibah as being Magi's as well, but in truth they're just protectors, trained to fulfill many of the same roles as a Magi, but without the official title to go with it. A bit of deception on my part that in truth I didn't actually plan, it just sorta happened as I wrote this script. Anyway, surprise, by being the last Magi, Bayek is the sole bearer of knowledge that comes with the position, some of which he passed on to Aya and had hoped to pass on in its entirety to Khemu, his presumed heir. It could be that, by wanting to go home to Siwa, Bayek doesn't just want to leave the courtly intrigues of the Ptolemies and Alexandria behind, but to also start again. To be a family again. To have another child, perhaps another son, to whom he can pass on the teachings, responsibilities, and title of Magi onto, to ensure the tradition lives on, even as the world around them changes at a precipitous rate. Aya, seeing this change, wants to leave that behind. Deep down I think she wants nothing more than that, but having now spent so much time away from Siwa and Bayek, she now sees, or perhaps simply believes, such a possibility is no longer feasible, let alone possible. The world has changed, and they need to change with it. That perhaps best sums up this divide between them, a wide and ever-growing gulf in perspectives. Aya seeing the big, ever-changing picture, though perhaps with some blinders, and Bayek meticulously reading between the lines but still clinging to an idea of a world that no longer exists. Had Septimius and the Gabiniani not escalated the situation to where it is now, then maybe they'd have some time to sort things out all proper-like, find some common ground, and perhaps come to a solution with regards to the future. But with the need to coalesce with Pompey now urgent, that possibility has been blown away like sand in a sandstorm. And none of this racing around matters in the end, for when we arrive at Pompey's presumed landing point, we find the scenes of a massacre, punctuated by the finding of Pompey's corpse, unceremoniously beheaded and left for the crows. Now it has to be noted that this Septimius fella is not a character wholly created by Ubisoft, but an actual historical figure who was indeed a leading figure in the Gabiniani and was indeed behind the real historical death of Pompey. As mentioned in part 3, Pompey had originally planned to head to Egypt to elicit Ptolemy XIII's support in his own war against Caesar, but the young king's advisors convinced him that killing Pompey would engender Caesar's favor, which, after the events of Pharsalus, was probably not a wholly bad idea, at least initially. Septimius, along with another Gabiniani named Salvius and a Ptolemaic general named Aculas, greeted Pompey under the guise of friendship before killing the old general as soon as he landed, taking his head to be later presented to Caesar along with his signet ring, with this entire event couched in origins as the machinations of the Order of Ancients and Septimius being a high-ranking member. Cleopatra will arrive shortly after we find Pompey and immediately demand to know where Caesar is, Aya informing her that he's already arrived in Alexandria with a portion of his forces. Historically, Caesar wouldn't arrive in Egypt until 3 days later, but this is really minor, so whatever. Cleopatra orders that she be brought to him immediately, despite the obvious danger in doing so, reasoning that, without Pompey's forces, she stands no chance of claiming the Ptolemaic throne, leaving Caesar as her only option. After this, we speak with Aya once more, beginning a sort of on-rails section for the next few hours of gameplay. Once we sail for Alexandria, there's no turning back until the job is done, with either Cleopatra on the throne or our heads on pikes. It should also be noted that once we set sail for Alexandria, that the historical record as it's presented in Origins is greatly compressed, with a few certain details and moments out of order, though I don't say this as criticism, as the historical events about to take place are exceedingly complex, and I can't imagine the literal flaming hoops the writers had to jump through to streamline it to fit within the space of a few short hours. With that said, I'll do my utmost to fill in the gaps and provide context where applicable. This will perhaps be the most complex section of this entire video, never mind this part, so wish me luck. Sailing to Alexandria begins with us literally sailing to Alexandria with another astoundingly fun ship section. As expected, we run into Ptolemy XIII's ships and engage them, this time with catapult support, sending them to the bottom and opening the way to Alexandria. Things get hairy when two of our ships are destroyed, forcing us on the defensive. More and more Ptolemaic ships arrive, eventually forcing us, with Cleopatra and Apollodorus, to abandon ship, while Phoxidas and the remains of his fleet fight them off. Now, there's no known records of there being any naval battles taking place between Cleopatra and Ptolemy's forces at this time, which is fine because who honestly doesn't love Origins naval battles? More importantly, however, it helps set up one of the most famous anecdotes regarding Caesar's time in Alexandria, Cleopatra's arrival, and how the two ultimately met, as attributed by later Roman sources, most famously by Plutarch. Upon arriving at Alexandria, Bayek and the gang have to figure out how to get Cleopatra into the royal palace. Naturally, they can't show up armed to the teeth or even in Cleopatra's company. It's then that Cleopatra, seeing some rugs handily nearby, gets an idea.
For once, perhaps a queen's entrance is unnecessary.
We're then given control of Aea as we join Bayek and Apollodorus in carrying some wares towards the palace, offerings of friendship to Caesar. One of these gifts just so happens to be a rug. And where's Cleopatra? Well, wrapped in the rug, of course, the writers playing on the famous tale of Cleopatra's dramatic and sudden appearance in the royal palace in 48 BC. Now, the use of a rug, or carpet as is often attributed, is considered more legend than true historical fact, as Plutarch claims that Cleopatra was hidden in a bed sack or hamper, but even this is contested by other, often later accounts. Cassius Dio, for example, merely claims that she just strolled into the palace finely dressed without telling her brother ahead of time. Why and how this story developed is unclear, though it's often simply attributed to being another example of Cleopatra's sharp cunning, a clever bit of deception brought lovingly to life by the short segment as we approach the palace. We manage to get inside the palace just as the young Ptolemy is presenting Pompey's head to Caesar and the two are about to begin alliance negotiations. Which is not wholly accurate, an example of that compression of historical events I mentioned earlier. As we approach the palace with the goods, you'll notice how everything is very calm and quiet, Caesar and his fellow Romans having been welcomed with seemingly open arms by Ptolemy and his advisors. Historically, however, the famous siege of Alexandria of 48 to 47 BC was already well and truly underway. Following his landing and initial negotiations, Caesar demanded a payment of 10 million denarii, approximately $435 million US, towards the debt Ptolemy XII Auletes owed to the Roman Republic, along with a declaration to mediate the dispute between Ptolemy XIII and Cleopatra. Not taking too kindly to this, Pothinos, the eunuch regent of the young pharaoh, whom we'll be running into a little later, sent secret orders to the general Aculas to summon his army of 20,000 to Alexandria. This army then besieged the city's royal quarter, with fighting beginning in earnest, even starting a fire that spread to the Great Library, though the damage is noted as being minimal. All the while, Ptolemy XIII was stuck inside the royal quarter with Caesar, the boy king probably and desperately trying to salvage the situation, his city, and his life. It's at this early stage of the siege that we, controlling Aea and in Cleopatra's company, arrive at Alexandria and bring the queen to Caesar, who reveals herself from the rug in dramatic fashion. As we can see, and as is noted in the sources, Caesar utterly and completely falls in love with Cleopatra, who offers herself up for a marriage alliance. Ptolemy XIII, while understandably not pleased, commits an absolute blunder and threatens to have Caesar and every other Roman in Alexandria killed if he goes ahead with this, which historically was kind of already happening, but whatever, which doesn't go over well with Caesar. Cleopatra tells him off, Ptolemy XIII storms off and returns to his forces. Historically, he had to sneak himself out. Cleopatra and Caesar head off to talk, and Apollodorus gives Bayek and Aea his praises for a job well done. Operation Sneaky Queen is a resounding success. For now. We then fast forward to the next day, or a few days, it's not entirely clear. It should be noted right from the off that this is the point where the timeline of events as it pertains to origins and the real historical record gets a little confusing somewhat, so bear with me on this one. As Aya, we meet with Cleopatra in the royal gardens, the queen coming to her with a favor. She wants to take Caesar to see the tomb of Alexander the Great, whom the Roman greatly admires, but the main entrance has been blocked by an earthquake that took place years earlier. Our job is simple, to find an alternate means of entry and open the way from the inside. Joined by Bayek, we find such a way, breaking through a wall and following the cisterns running beneath the city before eventually reaching the tomb itself. Now at first I thought it strange that Caesar would want, or at least be invited, to visit Alexander's tomb, the actual location of which has been lost to time and continues to be one of antiquity's great mysteries, while in the middle of a siege, but after some research it turns out Caesar did indeed visit the great conqueror's tomb at some point in 48 BC. Alexander had actually wished to be interred in Siwa, but this request was not honored, and his body was instead sent back to Macedonia, but was hijacked while en route by Ptolemy I, the first Ptolemaic king, who in turn interred the body in Memphis, before moving it later to Alexandria. It's often stated that this act was one of the main causes that led to Ptolemy getting into conflict with another general of Alexander named Perdiccas, who had been named imperial regent following Alexander's death, thus kickstarting the first of the many wars of the Diadochi that inevitably broke up Alexander's empire. Once inside the tomb, we begin to take a look around. Special attention is drawn to the inscriptions at the base of the sarcophagus, making mention of Siwa, its vault, a scepter, and a marked sphere. It's here that the orb from the earlier flashback, the one the Order believed was a key and tried to get Bayek to use to open the vault before Khemu's tragic death, is brought back into sharp focus. At some point, Bayek gave Aya the orb before she set off to Alexandria, who in turn gave it to Apollodorus. Before the matter can be discussed further, we hear banging on the door. Cleopatra, Caesar, and Apollodorus, who we let in. We see Caesar fanboy over Alexander, and Cleopatra lovingly patronize him before another Roman and Caesar's second, a man named Flavius, comes rushing in with some untimely news. Some of Caesar's emissaries have been captured and are in need of rescuing. Who's the Flavius guy, you may ask? More on him later, but remember his face and squeaky voice.
Our emissaries have been captured at the southern garrison of Alexandria.
Remember them. Aya offers to break them out, and with Bayek we head to the nearby garrison where they're being held. While Bayek starts a brawl, we sneak in. Though as you can see from my footage, it doesn't go exactly to plan. We find the emissary who warns us of the coming danger to Caesar and Cleopatra. In a flashback, we see Septimius torturing the poor man, joined by none other than the eunuch regent Pothinos, who turns out to be none other than the Scorpion. On the orders of another order member known as the Lion, presumably the head honcho of the bunch, the Ptolemaic forces are to march on the Pharos and its island, which is in Roman hands, thereby trapping Cleopatra and leaving her at their mercy. While this denotes the start of the siege in-game, which I remind you has technically already been ongoing for some time already, there is some amount of historical accuracy. About midway through the siege, Caesar had assaulted and captured the island, which controlled access to the city's harbors. Ptolemaic forces would launch repeated assaults on the island, even managing to take control of the bridge connecting the island and accompanying lighthouse to the mainland, though the island remained in Roman hands. There's even a famous anecdote where, after the Romans were forced to withdraw from the bridge, lest they be caught in a Ptolemaic pincer, Caesar's transport ship became overwhelmed and he was forced to strip off his armor, jump overboard, and swim to shore, keeping his left hand above the water the whole time to save some important documents. We bring the emissary back to Caesar and Cleopatra, the former immediately issuing orders to attack the Pharos and burn the Ptolemaic fleet in the process. Cleopatra, meanwhile, and being ever dramatic, plans to keep her lovely behind planted firmly on the throne, with Apollodorus staying by her side. She also has a particular order for Aya should she run into her brother. We reach the outskirts of the harbor, the Ptolemaic fleet already burning, where Aya sets off to light the signal meant for Caesar's fleet, doing this to prove a point to Caesar who, without saying the quiet part out loud, doesn't believe a woman is capable of such a task. We then proceed to clamber over the masts of the burning ships, with the Pharos looming in the distance, the Romans and Ptolemaians clashing below. A pretty striking set piece, I must say. This mission is presumably a combination of two events, the Roman attack on the Pharos and the island, as earlier described, and the burning of the Ptolemaic fleet, which happened earlier in the siege after Caesar ordered an assault on the Great Harbor and was followed by a naval battle that the Romans handily won. Our approach to and ascension up the Pharos comes to a climax when we face off against the Guardian, a Ptolemaic officer in the employ of the Order. Defeating him opens the way to the top, though before Aya can light the signal, she's ambushed by a soldier, the end of which we don't see. We then cut to Bayek and Caesar, who wait expectantly for the signal, the latter growing impatient. Eventually the signal goes out, and the two men leave the city aboard a chariot to rendezvous with the fleet, kickstarting the final phase of this portion of the saga. Now, as we can see, Caesar and Bayek leave the city while under incredible duress, flying along its streets while Romans and Ptolemies square off, actively pursued by Ptolemy's cavalry, with the plan being to rendezvous with Caesar's fleet on the Nile to initiate the final battle of Egypt's civil war. This moment is perhaps the most glaring inaccuracy of this section, as at no point did Caesar flee the city. In truth, the Ptolemaic army, after multiple failed attempts to retake the pharaoh's and royal quarter, were forced to abandon the siege after reinforcements from Roman Syria, commanded by Mithridates of Pergamum, arrived in the country and assaulted the city of Pelusium. Poised across the Nile, Ptolemaic forces redeployed to the east to contest Mithridates' crossing, allowing Caesar to leave the city and rendezvous with these forces. It should also be noted that some 3,000 Jews, contributed by High Priest Hyrcanus II and led by Antipater of Idumean, is that how you say it? Idumean? I don't know, moving on, were a part of Mithridates' relief force, and that they incited Alexandria's Jewish population to be more sympathetic to Caesar, which may have also had a hand in forcing the Ptolemaic army to leave the city. It is also noted in the sources that Caesar did leave in a hurry, though I doubt he did it while being pursued, especially by an elephant.
Hold the chariot steady! My focus is on not being trampled, Egyptian!
In any event, we rendezvous with the fleet before jumping forward to the pivotal Battle of the Nile, more particularly during its height. We learn of Pothinus' position and, now back in full control of Bayek, set off to take him down. Now it must be said that Pothinus was not at the Battle of the Nile, because he was already dead by then. The eunuch had been in the royal palace with Ptolemy XIII and Caesar when the siege of Alexandria began, having been the one to secretly order the Ptolemaic army's assembly and conduction of the siege. When Caesar found out about this, he had the regent promptly executed. A minor inaccuracy to be sure, and one that I won't dwell on beyond this, for his involvement here at the Nile leads to perhaps the most grandiose of all the boss battles in the game, as we face down the eunuch as he rides atop a ginormous war elephant. I know I've been pointing out a lot of historical inaccuracies, especially in this section, but don't take this as me trying to diminish the game's narrative in any way, as I know many of these changes were made for the sake of gameplay, streamlining the narrative, and allowing for moments such as our fight with Pothinus to exist, even if I come off as sounding more self-righteous than I mean to. As mentioned in the intro, I am in no way a trained historian, but merely a history buff, or perhaps more accurately as it pertains to myself, a borderline fanatical lover of history, especially for ancient Greek and Roman history. I only bring up these inaccuracies to help provide context to the narrative as it connects to the real-world history, in the hopes that you, dear viewers, learn something new and perhaps look into researching history in your own spare time. The duel with Pothinus, from a mechanical sense, is nothing to write home about, but I can't help but love it for its sheer awesomeness and scale. I've found the best strat for winning this fight is to keep your distance and only dive in for a few seconds to chip away at the elephant's health. You can also just hit it from range if you wish. Eventually we take Pothinus and his beast down and meet with the old eunuch in the Shadow Realm. Despite being a member of the Order and being the power behind Ptolemy XIII's despotic rule, Pothinus actually comes off as a fairly reasonable sort. For starters, he admits what happened in Siwa was a mistake. If you remember from the flashback in the vault, one of the masked men tried to be the voice of reason and calm, seeing how frightened Khemu was, essentially standing up for the boy, promising that no harm would come to Bayek and his son if they cooperated, a promise ultimately broken, if unintentionally. This masked man was none other than Pothinus, and by all accounts he's lived with deep regret over Khemu's death, even apologizing to Bayek for what happened and all that has since transpired. He's also not sadistic like his fellow Order members, nor does he have a craving for power. He genuinely believes in the Order's cause, of controlling the masses in the name of peace, exercising the cause through his influence over Ptolemy XIII and members of his court. As we've seen, this ultimately backfired, though I put this down to him being unable to control his fellow ancients and their actions, as well as the fact that he's not the head honcho, that individual presumably being the lion mentioned earlier. His influence only went so far and has come back to bite him in the ass. For all his aversion to violence and trying to be the voice of reason and calm, he ultimately failed and has thus accepted his death with grace and dignity, which Bayek grants. When we return to the real world, we're met by Caesar, who informs us that Septimius has been found and that Aya has caught Ptolemy XIII's scent. While Aya takes care of the boy king, Bayek's job will be to capture Septimius, while the Gabiniani's men are distracted by Caesar's forces. We find the jackal in a nearby village and promptly duel him. After taking him down, we're treated to a cutscene where Bayek gains the upper hand. Before he can finish him off, however, Caesar, in the company of Flavius, orders that Bayek leave him be, stating that he's a Roman and thus must be judged under Roman law. Bayek doesn't take kindly to this and attempts to kill the naked Iacta anyways before being subdued by Roman soldiers. We then cut to see Aya finally track down Ptolemy. Before she can kill him, however, the boy king is thrown into the Nile by some crocodiles, where he drowns. This moment is largely in keeping with the established narrative, that Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile, though the circumstances of his death are debated, as the sources of the time are either uncertain or unclear, the mystery being whether he was trying to flee or reach Roman lines to begin a new round of negotiations. In any event, after this we see Bayek get knocked out before cutting to Alexandria, where we see the city jubilant, celebrating the ascension of Cleopatra as sole ruler, with Caesar at her side. And who just so happens to join them? Septimius. Shit. Turns out the Jackal has been spared and is now working with Caesar and Cleopatra, the two lovers now seemingly in bed with the order. In turn, Cleopatra is dispensed with Bayek and Aya, giving them gold and banning them from the royal palace, most certainly at the behest of Septimius and whoever the lion is. She also blames them for the death of young Ptolemy, which... okay, I guess. The couple promptly take their fury out on Apollodorus, who does his best to calm their anger, to little avail, though even he concedes that something clearly isn't right. It's then we jump to the meeting I mentioned earlier in this part, where our allies, Phoxidas, who somehow managed to survive the fight at sea, Phanos, Pasaremta, and Tahira gather with Bayek and Aya to plot their next move. They begin to bicker amongst themselves before Bayek intervenes and gives an impromptu speech. I won't go deeply into the exact specifics of his speech because frankly it's pretty cliched. With that said, however, it's important to discuss, for it's from this speech that the groundwork is laid for the future of their motley brotherhood. Nothing is set in stone, but what it does is set a tone. A framework that will not just extend throughout the final hours of Origins and its DLCs, but the entire series. Bayek will begin by taking responsibility. By charging headfirst into the fight, full of rage and fury, he inadvertently made the Order of Ancients stronger. Now they hide behind crowns, behind kings and queens. Who does that leave to work in the shadows for the people? Why them, of course. Whether by the will of Anubis or just strange luck, this motley crew have been brought together to serve the people, to defend the free will of the oppressed many, held together by shared beliefs, shared values, a shared creed. Bayek then ends his speech with a promise.
And I promise that for all the songs of Egypt, I will be the father I was not that day in Siwa.
The crew toast their new alliance, but Bayek is cut off by Aya's disappearance onto a nearby balcony, where she expresses regret over her decision to side with Cleopatra. She also has a lingering question. During Cleopatra's victory speech, she will, at the end, raise aloft a special staff, which just so happens to be the scepter of Alexander, which had been taken from the conqueror's tomb by Septimius. But why? Bayek will then add that he and Flavius have been spending a lot of time at Alexander's tomb. Too much time, perhaps. With these questions comes a perfect starting place to begin their hunt anew, for Septimius and the one known as the Lion. From the balcony we set off for the tomb, where we find it heavily guarded, but by Romans, not Egyptians or Greeks, a telltale sign that something is amiss. We get our answer when we enter the tomb itself and find Apollodorus in combat with more Romans, though we're too late and he's quickly felled. Once we finish off the Romans, we speak with Apollodorus, who is sadly on the verge of death. Before he passes, however, he gives us some vital information. That it wasn't Septimius who killed Khemu, but Flavius, the Lion. There's more, however. Flavius took the orb that I had given Apollodorus, and with Septimius is on his way to Siwa. Apollodorus begs for them to leave right away before finally passing to the House of Hades. From there we jump to the outskirts of Siwa, where we find the town in a sort of ghostly haze and crawling with Romans. We also find the common folk strewn everywhere, though not dead, just in some sort of strange daze conjured by Flavius. Among them we find Rabia, who tells us to hurry to the vault, even mentioning Hepzibah, none of which bodes well. We eventually reach the vault, fighting Romans the whole way, the vault itself opening to us, which causes all remaining Romans to flee in terror. Heading inside, we find a strange projection of the whole world. By now you'll probably realize that the vault is of Isu creation, and if you're a veteran of the series, the strange orb we saw in the earlier flashback with Khemu and the masked men is in fact a piece of Eden. What's a piece of Eden, you may ask? Well, in simplest terms, it's an Isu device of immense power, the power in question dependent on the particular device itself. Isu orbs, such as the one in Siwa and now in Flavius' possession, are known as Apples of Eden, capable of controlling minds and used by the Isu to control their human subjects and effectively turn them into slaves. There are also Shrouds of Eden, capable of healing the most grievous injuries and supposedly able to bring back the dead, though this has been disproven,
What the fuck did you do?
And Swords of Eden, which are powerful weapons, to name a few. For simplicity's sake, we'll just refer to them all as pieces of Eden unless it's necessary to distinguish them appropriately. Somehow Flavius was able to harness the power of the orb, along with Alexander's scepter, which itself is a piece of Eden, to control the minds of the people of Siwa and render them more or less comatose, as well as open the door into the vault itself. This projection, which is never really addressed, is not the only thing we find in the vault, however. We also find Hepzibah, dead, another casualty of the Order.
It is Hepzibah. My Sammy. Your life is done here in the desert dust. They took my closest friend.
We must rush to stop Flavius.
No! We cannot leave him here!
A heartbroken Bayek will carry Hepzibah outside, where we're met by Rabia and many of the other townsfolk, the healer explaining what happened. How Flavius and Septimius entered the vault, Hepzibah tried to stop them and died in the process, and how Flavius used the staff to conjure the projection we saw and simultaneously render the citizens of Siwa comatose. What they sought in the vault, beyond the power it seemingly contains, is unclear, but ultimately doesn't matter, for the objective remains the same. They must die, for Khemu and for Hepzibah. Though before we can do that, we need to lay Hepzibah to rest. We then cut to a nearby necropolis, where our dear friend has been laid to rest. After taking some time to pay our respects, we speak with Rabia and Aya. From the old matriarch we receive Hepzibah's sword, while with Aya we plan our next move. According to a prisoner interrogated by the villagers, Flavius has gone to the Roman city of Cyrene, while Septimius has gone to Alexandria, with Bayek vowing to go after the former. It's also here that the couple, by all accounts, start to begin coming to terms with the truth of their union, though we'll explore that more when it becomes more pertinent towards the end, so just keep this in mind for now.
I feel as though wherever we go, tragedy follows. Perhaps we should come to terms.
From here, our journey once again takes us northward, this time to the heart of Roman influence in Egypt, kickstarting the final phase of this saga with one goal and one goal only: kill Flavius. As mentioned just moments before, our final hunt for Flavius takes us north from Siwa towards the city of Cyrene, where the line is believed to have gone. The city itself is the capital of Cyrenaica, an ancient land first mentioned by the Egyptians in the 13th century BC, and after being colonized by Greek settlers in and around 631 BC, has oscillated between being independent or under the rule of foreign powers, first under the Achaemenid Persians, then the Ptolemies. As of the events of origins, this land has been a province of the Roman Republic since 96 BC, when the last Greek king, Ptolemy Apion, died without heirs and bequeathed the land to the Romans in his will. It didn't immediately become a province, the Romans instead preferring to leave its administration to local rulers, but after a series of civil uprisings by the local Jewish population to stabilize the region in the 70s BC, the Senate officially annexed Cyrenaica in 74 BC, eventually combining it with Crete into a single province 7 years later. Arriving in Cyrenaica, our search for Flavius begins at a farm in its southern extremities, which I suggest we investigate so as to learn of the lion's whereabouts. Right away, in the following cutscene, we see that things are not as they seem. People bound at the neck by rope, while a priest starts killing them indiscriminately, yet no one resists, all of them in a daze, similar to what we saw in Siwa, clearly the work of Flavius and the apple. It's then that we see a Greek woman kill the priest and free the remaining prisoners, before turning her blade on Bayek, who manages to calm her down before she can do any damage. This woman is Praxila, a healer from the nearby town of Balagray, and together we search the farm for survivors, as well as clashing with Roman soldiers still hanging about. Things initially look bleak as we only find corpses, but eventually we find an old blind woman named Nanette, who regales us with the tale of what happened. In short, Flavius came and used the orb, which compelled people to either kill themselves or their loved ones, Nanette only escaping because of her frail figure and clouded eyes, along with remaining silent as the crypt. Unfortunately, they took her son Kade, along with anyone who could work. She also confirms what we've already assumed, that Flavius has gone north to Cyrene, the city of the Huntress, referring to the Greek goddess of the hunt, Artemis. After taking Nanette to her wagon, Praxila will give us her signet ring, which we can use to elicit the aid of a magistrate and old friend of hers in Cyrene named Diocles. She also points us in the direction of the Citadel, a gargantuan Roman fortress standing tall over southern Kyrenaica, where the boy Kade may have been taken. She also indirectly invites us to come visit her at her clinic in Balagray, saying that the place has troubles of its own, suggesting in a roundabout way that Bayek may be of some help. From here, we're given several avenues to follow. We can either head straight to Cyrene and continue the hunt for Flavius, or head for the Citadel or Balagray and see what we can do to help the people of the province. It's through these side quests that we're exposed to what life is like for the people of the province under Roman rule, which can be bluntly described as despotic, the people of the region being severely oppressed, especially the native Egyptians, not unlike what we saw in Alexandria and the Fayum, though one could argue that those in Kyrenaica have it far worse. The crux of this is centered around a massive aqueduct currently under construction, with the goal to bring water down from the mountains to help feed the farmlands of the Green Mountains, the hardest and most dangerous work being left for the native Egyptians, many of whom happen to be from Siwa, though whether they came here of their own volition or were forced is unclear. Things were already bad, but have since gotten worse with the return of Flavius, who just so happens to be the province's proconsul, spearheaded by the line's subordinate, General Agrippa. Now, it must be said that General Agrippa is not the same man as Marcus Agrippa, the military genius and right-hand man of Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus. The sources are uncertain as to whether he was ever in Africa, let alone Egypt at all during this time, though it's speculated that he did fight under Caesar in Spain during the latter half of his civil war against the Pompeians, serving with such distinction that Caesar sent him to be educated alongside Octavian at the civil war's end. It's also said that Marcus Agrippa was a modest and selfless man, preferring to defer credit for his achievements to Augustus, both out of loyalty to his friend and also because the future emperor had a penchant for removing people who potentially posed a threat to his rule. General Agrippa, on the other hand, is an ambitious piece of shit, an ambition that has only grown now that Flavius has returned to Kyrenaica, exacerbated by his penchant for cruelty towards the local populace. With that said, allow me to dive into what will perhaps be my most contentious opinion regarding this game and its narrative, and that's how the Romans are portrayed throughout. Put simply, I don't like it. At almost every turn, the Romans are regularly made to be wickedly evil and excessively cruel, when it could be argued that the truth is far more nuanced than the game would have us believe. Now, I'll admit, at the risk of disqualifying my argument right from the jump, that I'm a bit of a Romanophile, fervently believing the Roman Empire and the Republic that preceded it to be the greatest empire known to history, given how much modern Western civilization, particularly in terms of law and governance, is still heavily influenced by the Romans. I will also not disregard the fact that the Romans did indeed have a penchant for cruelty, usually in response to stiff resistance to their conquests and/or rule of particular lands. Just ask the Carthaginians, the Corinthians, the Jews, and the Gauls. Hell, it could be argued that Caesar, by today's standards and the term's definition, could be considered a war criminal given his actions in the Gallic Wars, where 1 million Gauls were killed and another 1 million were forced into slavery, though whether this constitutes as genocide is actively contested and debated by modern scholars and historians. Historian Tom Holland, in a documentary discussing the siege of Masada during the First Jewish-Roman War, perhaps best sums up the Roman way of thinking, especially when it came to subduing unrest.
People who have presumed to raise the banner of revolt against Rome have to be wiped out, and more importantly, they have to be seen to be wiped out.
Needless to say, the Romans were ruthless adversaries and overlords, but frankly, what empire wasn't? Building an empire, as history has shown time and time again, is a messy and brutal business. I mean, just look at the Mongols for God's sakes. How about the British and Spanish empires? It could be argued that, based on the historical sources, the Romans were only acting in accordance with given and accepted norms for the time, albeit with a substantial amount of Roman flair. The Ptolemies, for example, weren't exactly kind themselves, and even Alexander the Great, during his conquests, was known to inflict great cruelty and suffering of his own. Origens also seems to ignore the fact that the Romans were generally rather progressive in their policies towards conquered subjects. Now, what was progressive then is vastly different to what we would consider progressive now in the 21st century, but for the time, it was almost considered anomalous for the age. There are massive caveats to consider, of course, these policies often having more practical purposes than philosophical or moral ones, the vast complexities of which I won't get into, but the general omission of these progressive attitudes on the whole is frankly ridiculous. The Romans, like you and me, were a complex people with varied thoughts, emotions, and beliefs, and yet Origens would have us believe that almost all of them were brutish, sadistic thugs, which couldn't be further from the truth. Yes, we're seeing things from the perspective of Bayek, a native Egyptian, but this glaring lack of nuance we see in others, including the Order of Ancients I might add, is both baffling and really disappointing. And don't get me started on the game's portrayal of Caesar, but we'll dig into that later. Oh, and their arms and armor, but we'll leave that alone. maybe. Now I say almost because we do meet the odd Roman who isn't of the same ilk as Flavius, Septimius, or General Agrippa. At the aqueduct, we meet a Roman named Vitruvius, an architect, engineer, and former soldier credited with writing De Architectura, the only treatise on architecture to have survived from antiquity, and as such is regarded as the first book on architectural theory. There's even a short snippet of a later side quest where we have to recover his early manuscript of De Architectura after it's stolen by some bandits, which I thought was a really neat touch. We first meet Vitruvius at his main tent, where he saves an Egyptian worker from the cruelties of some legionnaires, before asking us to help find his dioptra, a tool so important to his work that construction of the aqueduct has ground to a halt, hence the excessively harsher than normal Roman treatment of the workers. He's also indirectly involved in the rescue of Cade, the son of the blind old woman Nanette we met earlier with Proxila. After rescuing him, the lad will tell us that the Romans have a volatile and destructive burning substance, an early version of Greek fire, which had been created by Vitruvius, though after we speak to the man, we learn that he never produced it himself and never wished to. While I haven't been able to find any evidence of Vitruvius creating such a weapon or substance during my research, it's probably meant to highlight his prior military service, with his descriptions in De Architectura hinting at locations across the western half of the Republic, including in Gaul while serving under Caesar. In any event, somehow General Agrippa got a hold of his notes on Greek fire and has started to produce it for a possible invasion of Egypt. At Vitruvius' behest, we sneak into the citadel, kill the general and steal the notes, destroy all the already prepared Greek fire stockpiles, then return to Vitruvius, who promptly destroys the notes. Vitruvius' quests form one part of a three-pronged subplot that ranges across Cyrenaica, the other two involving Praxilla, who we help take down a batshit crazy priestess named Melita, and Diocles, who we haven't met yet, helping him take down a corrupt magistrate named Leander. After these respective subplots within a subplot are finished, all three, along with Bayek, will meet at the shrine of the Oracle of Apollo just south of Cyrene, coming together to form Cyrene's triumvirate, to fill the void of leadership, albeit in a far more gentle and peaceful manner. Oh, and Diocles proposes to Praxilla, in a moment that's honestly kinda cute despite Vitruvius' gentle teasing. As mentioned before, most of the side quests in Cyrenaica and the neighboring Green Mountains are focused around the brutal Roman occupation of the region, with an added layer in how they tie into the work of the Order. Melita and Leander, for example, are found to be both followers of Flavius, though for very different reasons. There's also a substantial amount of irony to be found in them. Cyrenaica, along with its major settlements, Cyrene, Apollonia, and Balagrae, are majority Greek, a civilization that the Romans took great inspiration from, or stole from depending on who you ask, and yet despite their shared similarities in culture and religions, the Romans are just as oppressive with them as they are with the native Egyptians. It's an irony that can be seen time and time again across this region's side quests, and is one that is not lost on Bayek, who almost seems self-righteous about it even as it disgusts him.
The Greeks are learning what it feels like to be Egyptian. Have your land, your dead, and your relics desecrated by an invading force.
It is hoped that through the combined work of Cyrene's triumvirate, which includes both Greeks and a Roman, that Cyrenaica will blossom and prosper, driven by peace, order, and freedom for the masses, no matter their ethnicity. However, such a plan, or alliance even, won't happen both in a figurative and literal gameplay sense until we dispense with one man. Flavius. Let's go get the bastard. We meet with Diocles in Cyrene's Agora, or Central Market, showing him Praxilla's ring. Right away he directs us towards Cyrene's Acropolis, which the Romans have turned into a nigh impregnable fortress. Now you're probably thinking that this already seems way too easy, Flavius being practically handed to us on a silver platter. Yes, he's surrounded by numerous legionnaires, but compared to other order members we've hunted, getting to him is fairly straightforward. There are no hoops to jump through, no leads or trails to follow, no mysteries to unravel. All we gotta do is reach him and dispense with him. Seems all too convenient for what's supposed to be, as far as we know, our final mark. Then you finally face him and quickly realize that taking him down isn't going to be as simple as a nice jaunt in the park, the mad bastard taking full advantage of the apple's power, able to make himself teleport around and conjure specters at will, while a strange muted gold haze emanates across the arena. All the while, Flavius will taunt us and all of Egypt, zipping around the arena, making us whiff at nothing but empty air, which is why I strongly recommend you use your special ability as much as possible. While Origins' combat is rather rudimentary, I find this final fight with Flavius almost thematically perfect. Throughout our journey, we've gone up against foes who have conjured all manner of powers, both mystical and mundane against us, with only our wits and skills with the blade to aid us. The fight with Flavius is no different, with the defining edge being our and Bayek's persistence and perseverance, slowly but surely wearing the lion down bit by bit until we finally land the killing blow. It's in the Shadow Realm that we finally get to see just how cracked Flavius is, empty of remorse and regret at the death of Khemu, of a child. Khemu's death gave him power beyond his wildest dreams. It placed the Order, Caesar, the whole of Rome in the palm of his hand, his madness further accentuated by his handling of the orb. Bayek will rush Flavius in rage, but finds himself unable to send Flavius to the Duat, though whether this is due to some sort of mental block or some mysterious otherworldly power is unclear. It's then that Khemu appears.
Do it! I can't do
it! It's alright, Papa.
One plot point that we need to remember is that Bayek's hunt of the Order isn't just to rescue Egypt from their evil machinations, but to also finally put Khemu's soul to rest, so that he may finally pass through the Duat and enter the Field of Reeds. By being unable to do the deed and send Flavius to face his judgment, Bayek will have failed in making this so, rendering much of what he sacrificed moot. Khemu, however, disproves this assertion, the young boy allaying his father's fears before taking his feather and doing the deed himself. Bayek has succeeded. Khemu's Ka has been put to rest. With that done, we finally return to Alexandria to give Aya the good news. We meet with her in the underground library to give this news, but celebrations are quickly cut short when Aya announces her intentions to head to Rome. It's then that we're briefly and unexpectedly introduced to Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, two Roman patricians who have joined in the fight against Caesar and the Order. With Aya, they plan to head to Rome to finally take down Caesar and Septimius, the fight against the Order now having spread beyond Egypt's borders. If their names sound familiar, that's because they play a pivotal role in one of Rome's most infamous events, one that would begin the Roman Republic's dramatic, expeditious, and incredibly violent transition into an empire, though how they and Caesar's role in this story compared to the real history couldn't be more different and is very contentious, which will make more sense when we get to that oh-so-pivotal moment. Bayek is beyond bewildered, more so when Aya quickly leaves to make good on her plans. In his eyes, their job is done. Flavius is dead and Khemu's soul is at peace. What more do they need to do beyond what they've already done? Of course, things aren't quite so simple. Cleopatra, for instance, has gone to Rome with Caesar, leaving Egypt leaderless and rudderless, while the Order is still somehow running rampant in Memphis, which is perhaps why Pasaremta isn't present. In this vacuum, tyrants of all shapes and sizes have apparently begun to enforce their will upon the populace, though I don't think we really ever see this, though admittedly I haven't completed much of the post-game content outside of the DLCs, so I can't say that with 100% certainty. Even still, and even with his bewilderment and disappointment, Bayek can see the writing on the wall of his and Aya's relationship, and we follow her outside to a beach where we speak to her for one last time. It's here that both of them come to the same realization, even if it still takes a bit to get there, and it could be argued that Aya has come to it well before Bayek has. Khemu's death didn't just mean the loss of their child, but the one thing that kept their bond, their love, strong. With that bond long gone and everything that has transpired since, they now know that they have been called to serve a higher purpose, one that requires they finally abandon all that they knew before. No longer are they mother and father, husband and wife, protectors of Egypt. They must now serve in the darkness to preserve the light, the freedom of the people against the tyranny of those who would abuse their power. They will establish a new order, a new creed. That of the Hidden Ones, a brotherhood of assassins. A bittersweet but powerful ending. Only that we're not done there. After a brief return to the present, where Layla wakes up and is met by William Miles, Desmond's dad, who offers her a chance to join the assassins, blah blah blah, who honestly cares, we jump back in time to 46 BC. 1 year has passed since Bayek and Aya parted in Alexandria, the latter now leading a small fleet with Brutus and Cassius in the Tyrrhenian Sea, just off the coast of southern Italy. Aya is clearly still struggling to come to grips with parting from Bayek, and this can be seen in her feisty interaction with Damastes, though Phoxidas manages to cool her temper. In any event, the die is cast. There's no going back. Like all other seaborne missions in this game, the objective is fairly straightforward. All we need to do is sail for Rome. Of course, we still have an enemy Roman fleet to contend with the added challenge of fighter ships that we need to destroy. In any event, we destroy all enemies in our path and open the way to Rome, making landfall at the town of Antium. We then jump forward again, this time to Rome itself in 44 BC, on the Ides of March. Uh-oh, what's about to take place here, I wonder? I have a love-hate relationship with this section, for there are a string of inaccuracies ranging in degrees of severity, which we'll discuss as they happen. Those aside, allow me to say that I love the atmosphere of this section, which is apparent right at the beginning as Aea, Brutus, and Cassius approach the theater of Pompey, where Caesar is due to meet with the Senate. While only a small slice of Rome, you can almost feel the grandeur of the great and ancient city wash over you as you traverse the area, a raw embodiment of Roman power in its most literal form. Unfortunately, the inaccuracies start as soon as it begins, though I put this first one down more to a compaction of history to streamline the narrative. Aea will state that Caesar is about to be declared tyrant of all Rome, when in reality Caesar has already been dictator for a number of years. First elected for a year in 48 BC after his victory at Pharsalus, then again for 10 years in 46 BC, before being appointed dictator for life early in 44 BC. Thus, despite what the game suggests, this meeting of Caesar and the Senate, set to take place in the Curia of Pompey's theater, wasn't about declaring Caesar a tyrant. In reality, it was the last scheduled meeting between him and the Senate before he was due to leave for a planned campaign in the east against the Parthians. In any event, we see Caesar and Septimius together briefly before Caesar leaves for his meeting, leaving Septimius to face Aea for one final duel, the Gabiniani's flail now imbued with the power of the Isu. The fight itself isn't really anything to write home about, though I love the verbal back and forth between Aea and Septimius, as well as the contrast in fighting styles. Aea's nimbleness and speed with her daggers against Septimius' supercharged brute force approach. Eventually we take the bastard down and meet in the Shadow Realm, where we can finally put him down like a dog, Aea wasting no time in giving Septimius his due. Historically, the fate of Septimius is unknown, as all records of him stop after his murder of Pompey, leaving much to interpretation and creativity. In multiple stage plays, Septimius is forgiven by Caesar, while in HBO's Rome, Caesar has him executed. With that in mind, I quite like Septimius' fate and origins, given his role in the main story, as it takes these two potential outcomes and melds them together in a neat and tidy package. Recruited by Caesar before being unceremoniously dispensed by Aea. Wasting no time, we head straight to the Curia, though we have to navigate throngs of Roman soldiers to get there. Once inside, we don a senatorial robe and enter the Curia's central chamber, where we can listen in as Caesar speaks with the Senate. It's here that I want to touch on just how ludicrous Origen's depiction of Caesar is in this moment. While his depiction across the entire narrative, from when we first meet him in Alexandria to now, is already pretty shaky, it reaches its fever pitch here in the Curia, especially with, as mentioned previously, how it compares to Brutus and Cassius. For starters, he's depicted as a power-hungry tyrant that cares not for the people, despite claiming that he became dictator by their will alone. This is forgetting the fact that Caesar was a populist, belonging to the Popularis faction of the Senate, whose reforms and political moves were done to help the poor and impoverished of not just Rome, but the whole of Italy, which put them in conflict with the conservative Optimate senators, who were actively stealing land from the people and even enslaving them. Caesar, like all great men and women in history, was immensely complex, and while he was certainly self-serving in his rise to power, there can be no argument that he was immensely popular with the common folk because he wanted to improve their lot in life, including stopping the criminal excesses of the conservative Optimates. Contrast this with how Brutus and Cassius are portrayed. Despite their limited screen time, their depictions are just as ludicrous. They themselves were a part of the Optimate faction, and even launched the conspiracy against Caesar themselves not long after he was named dictator for life. This makes their involvement with Aea and the newly formed Hidden Ones ridiculously unlikely. After all, the Hidden Ones served the people, just as Caesar did in real life, which should make them enemies of Brutus and Cassius. Yes, Brutus and Cassius formed the conspiracy in response to Caesar's new kingly position, but their reasons were nowhere near as altruistic as portrayed here. Caesar was threatening the privileged positions of the conservative Optimates, who had no wish to see their powers handed over to the people, and thus Caesar had to die. This dramatic and unexplained switch in positions between them really diminishes this part of the ending, accentuated further by when Aea speaks to Caesar one last time in the Shadow Realm, turning this titan of history into a one-dimensional, horribly inaccurate villain. Either way, as Aea, we can either just stab Caesar right away or listen to him waffle on. Aea will step back, allowing the remaining conspirators to finish the job, including Cassius and Brutus, who Caesar will acknowledge with this moment's most famous line.
You too, my child.
The tyrant is dead! You are free now!
Following this, we get one last scene with Cleopatra, Aya finding her in her home, along with a young boy. The boy in question being the first child of Caesar and Cleopatra, Caesarion. The scene is brief. Aya gives Cleopatra one final warning before leaving. Nothing more, nothing less. We then fast forward another year, with Aya having set up shop in Rome, penning a letter to Bayek, announcing the death of Caesar and Septimius. She also makes an announcement. She has founded a Hidden Ones Bureau in Rome, unseen and unheard. While we listen to Aya recite the letter, we see Bayek and some new recruits in action, including Tahira's induction, rescuing children from some cruel woman and setting them free. Aya will then end the letter with her own proclamation, that she has renounced all that she loves, including her own name. She is no longer Aya, but Amunet of the Hidden Ones. So officially begins the reign of the Hidden Ones, of the Assassins. The scene ends in Memphis with Bayek reading the letter. We're soon returned to the open world where we can complete any side quests or activities left undone or jump straight into the DLCs. A bittersweet ending, to be sure, and despite the rather rushed feeling of the ending and its glaring problems in historical accuracy, I can't help but feel satisfied. So ends the story of Assassin's Creed Origins. Assassin's Creed Origins represents a bold new direction in Ubisoft's largest and most successful franchise, with a bold story, narrative, and setting to match. While it took a bit to win me over when it first came out in 2017, it very quickly became a game that I very much enjoy and look forward to coming back to from time to time. Despite some of its glaring historical inaccuracies, flawed depictions of certain characters and cultures, and the fact that the modern-day storyline is still a thing, I fully believe that the developers succeeded in their narrative vision. And despite these growing pains, some of which will continue to plague its sequels, Origins provided a wonderful springboard for the developers and writers to continue iterating and improving. Origins walked so Odyssey and Valhalla could run, and while it could be debated as to what ends, good and bad, this led to, there can be no doubt that those two latter games wouldn't have existed as they are without the wonderful success Origins provided as a foundation. For these reasons, I firmly believe that Origins, despite its problems, will be fondly remembered for years to come as a sort of renaissance moment for the Assassin's Creed franchise, and while the light it has illuminated has waxed and waned in the years since, it, like the magnificent ruins of the land in which it's set, continues to persist, which I, for one, hope continues.